Hello everyone, I'm the Creeps Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I had been driving for hours down a narrow, twisting forest road that seemed to get darker the further I went, even though the sun had barely set. The trees grew thick on either side of the road, their branches arching overhead like they were trying to block out the sky. I had rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere for a weekend of solitude. No neighbors, no cell service, just the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has forgotten you exist. I had arrived just as the last streaks of sunlight faded, and the forest was settling into the deep, oppressive darkness of night. The cabin itself was small but solid, made of dark, weathered wood that looked like it had been standing for decades. There was a narrow porch in front with a single light hanging above the door, the bulb flickering occasionally as if it were struggling against the night. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and let the engine run for a moment while I took in the surroundings. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. Dust covered the corners of the room, and the furniture was simple. A small wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed pushed into the corner. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though the woodpile beside it was damp and the fire wouldn't stay lit. I set my bag down and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been building since I turned off the main road. Night fell fully, and I decided to explore the area around the cabin before it got too dark. The forest stretched all around, trees rising like silent sentinels. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and thick layers of dead leaves. Every step I took sounded unnaturally loud, like the forest was amplifying my presence. I found a small stream not far from the cabin, its water cold and clear. The faint trickle was the only sound aside from the occasional snap of a twig under my own feet. I felt a brief sense of relief. At least there was something living nearby, even if it was just the water. When I returned to the cabin, darkness had fully swallowed the forest. I lit a few candles and tried to make the room feel less intimidating, but the shadows seemed to move in the corners no matter how I positioned them. I unpacked a few things and prepared a simple dinner, but every small noise outside, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but my pulse kept quickening with each sound. Later, I decided to sit by the fireplace to read. I had brought a book, though I found I couldn't concentrate. The silence outside was heavy, almost physical, and I kept catching movement in the periphery of my vision, branches shifting, shadows stretching. Eventually, I realized it wasn't the shadows, it was the sound. A low, deliberate crunch of footsteps through the leaves. Someone or something was moving outside the cabin, and it was getting closer. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't match anything I had ever heard in the forest. It was heavier, deliberate, measured. I didn't move, hardly breathing, listening as the steps circled the cabin. The gravel path I had parked on earlier crunched under weight that seemed too deliberate for an animal. I thought about going to the door, but every instinct told me not to. I could hear the faint brush of something against the wooden siding, a scraping that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart raced, and I realized I had no weapon, no way to defend myself if someone came in. The isolation I had wanted now felt like a trap. I grabbed the largest branch I could find in the cabin, a fireplace poker, and pressed myself against the far wall. I could hear breathing now, slow and shallow, but I couldn't tell whether it was human or not. It was getting colder inside, though the temperature outside hadn't dropped that much. My breath fogged in front of me, and the candle flames flickered as if responding to some unseen movement. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The footsteps receded, then returned, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I could hear them pause at the front door, the scraping sound sharp against the wooden panels. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had stopped waiting. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, like the forest was holding its breath along with me. I waited what felt like hours until the first faint hint of dawn light touched the forest. The footsteps stopped entirely, and I finally allowed myself to move, shaking and pale. I cautiously approached the door and looked outside. There was no one. The gravel path was undisturbed except for a single set of muddy footprints leading away from the cabin and into the trees. Large footprints, too large to be human alone, but the shape was oddly distorted, as if someone had been dragging something or wearing shoes that didn't fit properly. I didn't wait to see more. I packed what I could quickly, ignoring the sense of disorientation and fatigue that made my hands shake. The forest that had seemed so peaceful in the daylight now felt suffocating, threatening. Every tree looked like it could hide something, every shadow a potential danger. I drove out of the gravel path as fast as I could without losing control, the tires crunching over loose rocks, the trees blurring past. Hours later, back on the main highway, I pulled into a gas station. My hands were still trembling, and the sweat hadn't stopped. I bought a coffee I didn't drink, just to steady myself, and tried to tell myself it was over, that the forest and the cabin were behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting, patient and deliberate. The next day, I called the rental service to cancel the remainder of my stay. The cabin had seemed innocent in the daylight, almost picturesque, but I knew the truth. There was no supernatural force, no ghost, no fairy tale creature. Just the forest, the darkness, and someone or something that had been close enough to see me, study me, and choose not to act for now. I never went back, and I never wanted to. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are not imagined, not fantastical, but painfully real, patiently waiting in silence. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that wherever I went, I was being watched. The fear had lodged itself inside me, small and persistent, like a shadow that never left. I stopped going to remote areas, stopped seeking isolation. The forest had taught me a lesson. Some places, no matter how beautiful, are not meant to be visited alone. And some nights, no matter how well you think you prepared, the darkness has a way of reminding you that you are not as safe as you think. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. But sometimes late at night, I see the forest in my dreams. The tall, dark trees, the heavy silence, the faint crunch of footsteps just beyond the light. And even in sleep, I feel the same terror, the same awareness that something real, something patient, waits where you least expect it. The cabin was gone, but the memory of being utterly alone, utterly exposed, stayed with me in a way nothing else ever had. It's the kind of fear that doesn't fade. It becomes a part of you. And that, I realized, was far scarier than any ghost or fairy tale could ever be. I started avoiding the idea of solitude entirely. Hikes became day trips. Camping trips always had people around. I carried a knife, a flashlight, anything that gave me even a fraction of the control I had lost that night. The forest still called to me in quiet moments, but I never answered. The memory of the cabin, the footsteps, the waiting presence, was too vivid, too real. Years later, when I drive past wooded areas on long roads, I remember that night. The oppressive silence, the cold, deliberate presence of someone, or something, moving just outside my window. And I think about how easy it is to feel safe in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. How quickly that sense of safety can evaporate when the night grows long and the world seems to shrink around you. The lesson is simple but unforgettable. Some places are only safe in daylight, and some dangers do not need to announce themselves to be terrifying. They simply exist, waiting, patient, real. Even now, when I tell the story to myself, I relive the weight of that night, the fear of the unseen, the helplessness. And I know that no matter how far I go, no matter how safe I think I am, the memory will always remind me of what real fear feels like. It's not a story you tell around a fire for fun. It's a memory you carry because it changed the way you look at the world forever. The forest still exists, the cabin still stands, but I don't. Not there. I learned the hard way that some places are better left alone, and that sometimes the scariest things are not supernatural or imagined. They are the ones that quietly, patiently exist, just beyond your sight, waiting for the right moment to remind you that you are never truly alone. I never went back to that part of the country. I never took another trip alone. But the cabin taught me something that has stayed with me longer than anything else. Fear doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to chase. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing is the silent knowledge that you are being watched, that someone else has the time to wait, to study, to observe you, and that you can't do a thing about it except survive and hope. The memory fades slowly, but it never disappears. And I know, if I ever find myself on a remote road again, near an old, isolated cabin in the woods, I will turn around without hesitation. because some lessons are learned only once, and the cost of forgetting them is far too high. I remember driving down the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, the tires crunching over loose gravel and the branches scraping softly against the sides of the car. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sky was a dull, gray smear that promised rain. It had been a long week, and I had convinced myself that a few days alone in the woods would be exactly what I needed to clear my head. The cabin was tucked into a small clearing surrounded by tall evergreens, their trunks dark and slick from the recent drizzle. It looked abandoned at first glance, weathered by years of wind and rain, but solid. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were streaked with dust, but the door locked properly, and the roof had no holes, at least that I could see from the outside. I parked the car and climbed out, feeling the cool dampness bite through my sweatshirt. The smell of wet pine needles and the faint odor of decaying leaves hit me immediately. I unlocked the door, and the hinges groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder, heavier, the kind that makes your lungs tighten just slightly. Dust motes floated in the streaks of light coming through the grimy windows. The cabin smelled of wood, old smoke, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward the center of the room. I dropped my bag on a corner table, ran a hand over the rough surface, and took stock of the place. There was a small fireplace, its brick coated with layers of soot, a couch with cushions faded to an almost grayish brown, and a kitchen area with a sink, a small stove, and cabinets that probably hadn't been opened in months. The cupboards were empty except for a few old cans that were probably decades past their expiration date. I checked the back door, then the windows, making sure everything was secure. The thought of being alone in the cabin made a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself it was just the cold. I decided to start a fire. The woodpile outside had some dry logs, and I carried them in, stacking them carefully in the fireplace. I struck a match, and the small flame trembled before catching the kindling, flickering against the walls. The room lit up with a warm glow, and for a moment, I felt some comfort in the crackle of the flames. The shadows danced across the ceiling and walls, moving like restless shapes. I shook off the unease and began unpacking a few supplies I had brought: a sleeping bag, some food, a lantern, and a few extra blankets. Night fell quickly. The gray sky darkened into a thick black, and the forest around the cabin seemed to close in. The wind picked up, rattling branches against the windows, and the rain began in earnest. It was heavy, drumming on the roof and pooling along the edges of the clearing. I lit the lantern, its warm light pushing back some of the darkness, but not all of it. I could hear the forest alive outside, drops of rain hitting leaves, small branches snapping, the occasional thump that could have been a deer or something else. My mind tried to rationalize every sound, but each one made me tense up. I had just settled near the fire with a book when I heard it, a soft scraping, almost like fingernails or claws dragging along the side of the cabin. My stomach twisted. I froze, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and I told myself it was just a branch caught in the wind. I tried to focus on my book, but every creak of the cabin, every thump of the rain, made me flinch. The fire flickered and cast shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames, stretching across the walls in shapes that didn't belong. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. I tried to sleep, rolling up in my sleeping bag, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was just outside, watching. The scraping came again, slower this time, deliberate. My heart raced, and I forced myself to remember that I had checked all the locks. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and shallow. I thought about calling someone, but my phone had no signal out here. I realized then that I was completely alone, completely cut off. By midnight, I had moved every piece of furniture away from the windows and doors that could be moved. I found an old baseball bat under the bed and kept it close. I stayed awake, watching the fire, listening. The scraping sound returned, this time followed by a faint thud on the porch, almost like someone stepping carefully but with weight. I forced myself to stay calm, to rationalize it: a fallen branch, a raccoon, a deer. But the noise had a rhythm, a weight that didn't belong to any animal I knew. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to silence. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. The rain had stopped. I could see the moon peeking through breaks in the clouds, pale and cold. I got up, my legs stiff, and moved to the window. Outside, everything was still, the forest dark and dense. But then I saw it, a shape moving among the trees, low and deliberate. My first thought was another animal, maybe a bear, though the movement seemed wrong, too careful, too intentional. I ducked back from the window, my heart hammering. I stayed crouched near the fireplace for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Eventually, the sky lightened slightly, and I realized the night was nearly over. I hadn't slept properly, hadn't eaten, hadn't even drunk water. My nerves were raw, every sound amplified. I needed to get out, to put distance between me and whatever had been out there. I packed quickly, moving as quietly as I could. My backpack was heavy with the few supplies I'd brought. I checked the locks one last time and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, the forest quiet except for the soft drip of residual rain. I kept my eyes on the tree line, scanning for movement. Every shadow made me flinch. I hurried down the dirt road toward the main road, the tires crunching under my feet where I had left the car. When I reached the car, I froze. The tires were flat. I cursed under my breath and checked for tools. There was nothing, no spare, no jack, nothing. I looked back toward the cabin. The clearing was empty, silent. I tried to calm myself, remembering that I was trained to handle emergencies, that I had done this before on long hikes, long trips alone. But my mind raced. I had no way to call for help. No one knew exactly where I was. Then I remembered the old shed a short distance from the cabin. I had seen it when I first arrived, partially hidden by trees. Maybe it had something inside, tools, anything. I ran through the mud and wet leaves, keeping my gaze fixed on the forest edges. Reaching the shed, I found it old and battered but unlocked. Inside there were some old tools, a crowbar, a small axe, and a set of wooden wedges. Nothing to inflate a tire, but at least a way to defend myself if necessary. I grabbed the axe and carried it back to the car, my heart still hammering in my chest. I considered walking all the way to the main road, which could be miles, but I knew I didn't have much time. The sky was lightening, but the sun was barely over the horizon, and I had no idea if anyone would be driving by. I tried to flag down a car, waving frantically as I reached the main road, my boots soaked, mud clinging to every inch of me. Minutes passed, but then, finally, a truck appeared. I waved harder, jumping up and down, screaming as loud as I could. The driver slowed, then stopped, looking confused but alert. I ran to the vehicle, heart racing, and explained in short, clipped sentences that I was stranded, that my tires were flat, that I needed a ride. The driver, an older man with a kind face, agreed without question and loaded my backpack into the bed of the truck. As we drove away, the cabin disappeared behind the trees, smaller and smaller, until it was just another shadow in the woods. The air in the truck was warm, the engines hummed comforting. I finally allowed myself to breathe, to let the tension in my body release. I knew I would come back to that place eventually, perhaps to retrieve the car, perhaps just to prove to myself that it hadn't been some figment of my imagination. But for now, I was safe. I had escaped the cabin and the night, and the forest that had felt so alive with unseen eyes was behind me. Even as the miles stretched between me and the cabin, the images of the night stayed with me. The scraping on the side of the building, the deliberate shape moving in the trees, the weight of isolation pressing down. I knew that what I experienced was real, and that it was a reminder of how unpredictable the wilderness could be, how careful one had to be, and how quickly comfort could turn into fear. But I also knew I had survived, and that knowledge, hard-won and exhausting, gave me a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I kept that thought with me as the truck carried me away, the cabin disappearing into the distance, just another part of the forest, waiting silently for the next person. The rest of the day passed slowly. I found a small town, a gas station, and called for someone to come help with the car. The man from the truck waited, chatting quietly, offering a simple kindness that reminded me of the world outside the forest. By the time help arrived, I had a hot coffee in my hand, my clothes drying in the sun, and the tension in my shoulders slowly easing. I looked back toward the tree line one last time. The forest was quiet, the cabin hidden among the tall pines, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel relief. I had made it through the night, alone, scared, and uncertain, and I had come out the other side. I would remember it forever, but I would also remember the clarity and the quiet strength that came from facing it and surviving. The cabin remained a memory, real and terrifying, but ultimately, it became a story of endurance, of caution, and of the raw unpredictability of nature. And as I drove further away, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and pride, knowing that the forest, with all its shadows and sounds, had not claimed me. I drove down the winding dirt road as the late afternoon sun fell behind the trees, the long shadows stretching across the path like dark fingers reaching out. The air smelled sharp with pine and damp earth, a scent that felt both alive and unsettling. I hadn't seen another car for hours, and the silence around me pressed against the windows of the truck. Each bump in the road made me feel smaller, more exposed, as if the forest itself was watching me pass. When I finally reached the cabin, it was nestled in a small clearing, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and tall, dry grass. The structure looked older than I expected, the wood darkened with age and weather, but it held a sturdy shape. A chimney leaned slightly to the side, and the windows, clouded with dirt, reflected the fading sunlight like dull eyes. I parked and got out, feeling the weight of the quiet settle over me. The air was cooler than I had anticipated, and every sound, the rustling of leaves, a distant bird call, even the creak of the truck's door, felt amplified. The first thing I noticed was how alone the cabin was. There were no neighboring houses, no roads visible beyond the one I had driven on, only the thick forest pressing in from all sides. As I walked toward the front door, I could see the ground was littered with pine needles and dry leaves. Footprints from animals were scattered across the clearing, some fresh, some older, each one adding to the feeling that I was stepping into a space controlled by things I couldn't see. The door was heavy, swinging with a soft groan as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly sour, like mold or rotting leaves. Light from the windows slanted across the wooden floorboards, illuminating the layer of grime that had settled there over years. The space was small but functional, with a simple kitchen to one side, a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades, and a wooden table with chairs that wobbled under the slightest touch. The living area had a small couch, faded and sagging, and a rug that had lost most of its color. I ran my hand along the edge of the table and felt the roughness of the wood, small splinters pricking my skin. Everything in the cabin carried the weight of time, of being left alone in the middle of the forest, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I set my bag down and walked to the windows, pushing aside the dust-coated curtains. The forest was already deepening into shadow, and the sun had dipped behind the horizon. The sky was a dim gray, and the trees swayed with a quiet, constant motion. I could just make out a narrow trail leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the darker parts of the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flash of something darker than the surrounding trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination reacting to the isolation. Still, a feeling lodged itself deep in my chest, an unease I couldn't shake. I decided to light a fire in the stove. The match flared, lighting the dry kindling I had found in a corner. The flame caught, sputtering for a moment before steadying, sending a warm glow across the room. Shadows leapt along the walls, long and twisted, and the smell of burning wood filled the cabin. I sat on the couch, my eyes following the play of light and dark, and tried to calm my mind. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and every little sound, the tap of a branch against the window, the rustle of leaves outside, made me jump. I tried to focus on practicalities, checking the locks, making sure I had water, and finding a place to sleep. But even as I ticked off these small tasks, the sense of being watched lingered. It wasn't fear in the classic sense, more like a tension that built steadily, a pressure pressing in from all sides. As night fell fully, the cabin grew colder. The fire gave off warmth, but the corners of the room remained dark, almost absorbing the light. I moved through the space methodically, making sure all the doors and windows were secure. The back door had a simple latch, and I double-checked it, listening for any sounds from outside. The forest pressed against the walls, the trees close enough that I could see the branches sway and hear the occasional snap of a twig. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thump, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. My heart was hammering, my chest tight. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the forest. But the thumps came again, deliberate, almost like someone was stepping carefully, aware of the cabin but trying not to make noise. I grabbed the old flashlight I had brought and shined it toward the windows. The beam cut through the darkness outside, illuminating the trees and the undergrowth, but there was nothing. I walked to the door and held the flashlight out, moving it slowly along the perimeter of the clearing. At first, I saw only the familiar shapes of branches and trunks. Then, near the far edge of the clearing, a shape shifted. My stomach clenched. It was tall, hunched slightly, moving in a way that didn't seem natural for a deer or bear. I held the flashlight steady, trying to get a better look, but when I blinked, it was gone. My mind raced. Could it have been a shadow, a trick of the light, or had someone or something been standing just beyond the tree line, watching me? I decided to sit near the fire and keep the flashlight within reach. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, set my nerves on edge. Hours passed slowly, the wind picking up outside and rattling the roof. The thumping returned, soft at first, then growing louder, closer, as if whatever it was had begun moving toward the cabin. I gripped the flashlight, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold. I tried to stay calm, reasoning that the sound could only be an animal. But then I heard the faint scrape of metal against wood, deliberate, slow, methodical. Something had touched the cabin. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer brushing against the wall? A branch falling? None of it fit the sound. This was intentional, deliberate, like someone, or something, was testing the cabin, looking for a way inside. I stayed crouched near the fire, barely breathing, listening. The scrape came again, louder, closer to the door. I gripped the flashlight and the small hatchet I had brought, prepared to defend myself if necessary. The sound stopped suddenly. Silence pressed in, thick and heavy. I waited, heart racing, for what felt like hours. Then, from the direction of the trees, I heard a low growl. It was deep, guttural, not the sound of any animal I had heard around these parts. My stomach dropped. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my truck was parked 50 feet away, and to get there I would have to cross the clearing, open and exposed. I stayed frozen, gripping the hatchet tightly, eyes darting between the windows and the shadows. The growl faded, replaced by silence. Minutes passed. I forced myself to calm down, to think logically. I checked the doors and windows again, ensuring they were latched and locked. The cabin was old, yes, but structurally sound. Nothing could get in quickly without effort. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire dying down to embers, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. Every shift of wind, every distant crack of a branch, made me jump. Dawn finally crept over the horizon, gray and muted, filtering through the trees. I felt an immense relief just seeing the light. The forest looked less threatening in the daylight, the shadows retreating, the shapes of trees and undergrowth returning to their natural form. I packed my things quickly, not taking the time to eat or even finish checking the cabin. My eyes scanned the tree line constantly, expecting to see the shape from the night before. When I reached my truck, I hesitated, looking back at the cabin one last time. The clearing was empty, silent except for the wind moving through the pines. I climbed into the truck, hands still shaking, and started the engine. The rumble felt reassuring. As I drove away, the road winding back through the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin shrank into the distance, small and still, yet somehow heavier in memory than its actual size. I told myself the feeling of being watched was my imagination, that the sounds had been nothing more than animals and the wind. But deep down, I knew something had been there that night, something deliberate, patient, and observing. By the time I reached the main road and civilization returned, the streetlights, houses, and the distant hum of traffic, I felt the tension in my body slowly unwind. I promised myself I would never return to that cabin alone. The memory of that night stayed with me, haunting in its realism, not because of ghosts or legends, but because of the raw, visceral sense of vulnerability. The forest is indifferent to humans, yet capable of making you feel like the smallest thing alive. And sometimes it seems something else shares that space, something waiting, patient, and real. The thought made me grip the steering wheel tighter, glad to be moving away, leaving the cabin and the forest behind, carrying with me a story I would never forget, a cautionary weight lodged firmly in my mind. I had been driving for hours along a twisting, two-lane road that seemed to vanish into the dense forest on either side. The sun was low, barely pushing its last warm light through the trees, casting long shadows that made the road ahead look like a tunnel of dark green and black. I wasn't in a hurry, but there was this nagging feeling in my chest that I should reach the cabin before nightfall. I had rented it online, a small, secluded place, far from any town, promising solitude and quiet, and I wanted that. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the isolation would begin to press against me once I turned off the main road and onto the narrow dirt track leading to it. The driveway was barely wide enough for my car, overgrown with brush on either side. I had to swerve carefully to avoid scraping the sides against thick branches. The cabin came into view finally, tucked between tall pine and fir trees, its wooden exterior blending almost perfectly with the forest. It was small, with a single story and a steep roof. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, though I couldn't see anyone around. The place seemed untouched, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked up the small wooden steps to the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud, echoing into the trees around me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, but there was a faint hint of smoke lingering in the air. The walls were bare except for a few crooked shelves and a mounted lantern by the door. A small fireplace dominated one corner of the main room, and the furniture was sparse. A single wooden table with 2 chairs, a tattered sofa, and a bed tucked into the far corner. Everything seemed functional but worn. I set down my bag and looked around, noting the windows. They were thick, old glass, and while they let in some light, the forest outside looked darker than it should for this hour. The shadows moved subtly, branches brushing against one another, creating forms that looked like they shifted in the corners of my eyes. I started unpacking, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling along my spine. I lit a few candles and stacked some firewood near the fireplace. The cabin seemed small and cozy now, but the forest pressing against the windows gave it a cage-like feeling. Every creak of the wood under my feet sounded loud. Every rustle of leaves outside felt deliberate. I told myself it was just the wind, just the forest, nothing more. I decided to explore a little before night fell completely. There was a small trail that led behind the cabin, winding into the thick woods. At first, it was easy to follow, soft dirt under my feet and fallen leaves that crunched gently with each step. Birds were silent, and the forest was unnaturally still. After a few minutes, the trail narrowed and twisted, and I found myself stepping over roots and around fallen logs. My legs were getting scratched by low branches, and the air felt cooler, damper. The sun was almost gone, leaving only a faint glow behind the trees, and the shadows deepened. I turned back, realizing that I had gone farther than I intended, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. When I reached the cabin again, the darkness had fully settled. I lit the fireplace and let the warm glow fill the room. Outside, the wind picked up, and the trees groaned as if the forest itself were alive. I ate a simple dinner, bread and cheese, and then decided to settle in for the night. The bed looked comfortable, but I chose to sleep in the sofa instead, feeling safer closer to the center of the room. The candlelight flickered across the walls, casting moving shadows that danced as the flames struggled against the draft coming from the slightly open window. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't a soft, distant sound. It was deliberate, a snapping of a branch, then another, coming from somewhere just outside the cabin. My heart rate quickened, and I listened, holding my breath. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, slower this time, deliberate, as if someone or something was moving around the cabin. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the way the footsteps shifted and pressed against the underbrush felt human. My hands shook slightly as I moved toward the door, peeking through the curtain. There was nothing visible, just the dark, empty forest. I sat back down on the sofa, trying to control my panic. The noise continued in intervals, faint at first, then growing slightly louder, always outside, never moving away. I grabbed a flashlight from the table, clicking it on. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the trees, the undergrowth, and the thick shadows beyond. I scanned slowly, carefully, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Every creak of the cabin, every small wind gust against the roof, sounded like someone moving closer. Hours passed, though I couldn't be sure of time in that isolation. The fire had burned low, and I refilled it, keeping my eyes on the windows. Around 3 a.m, I heard it again, this time closer, right outside the cabin. The footsteps moved around the perimeter, slow and steady. My pulse was racing, and I kept the flashlight aimed at the door. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear the faint scraping of leaves and twigs, deliberate and close. Suddenly, the cabin door handle rattled. I froze, staring at it. The sound was small, almost hesitant, but it was definitely there. My first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to run in the dark. The nearest town was miles away. I grabbed a heavy piece of firewood and held it in front of me. I clicked the flashlight toward the door again. The handle stopped moving, and the forest was silent. Too silent. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, firewood in hand, flashlight pointed toward the door, every nerve stretched tight. Morning came slowly, pale light filtering through the window. I finally allowed myself to breathe, convinced the night had been a test of my imagination, of how much fear the isolation could bring. I opened the door cautiously, expecting to find some evidence of whoever or whatever had been there. There was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign anyone had been near. I spent the next day exploring the immediate area around the cabin, trying to shake off the lingering dread. I discovered a small creek, its water clear and moving quickly over rocks. The sound of the water was calming, and I used it to fill my water bottles. I followed the creek a short distance, finding that it led to a small clearing surrounded by trees. It was peaceful, almost beautiful, and for a while I let myself relax. The forest wasn't threatening in the daylight. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves felt normal, and the shadows didn't feel like they were moving against me. That night, I prepared for the possibility of another long, sleepless night. I reinforced the door by wedging the remaining firewood against it and ensured all the windows were tightly shut. I slept lightly, fire crackling, flashlight by my side. I woke several times to small noises, branches snapping, the wind moving through the trees, but nothing like the night before. It was a long night, but I survived without incident. The following morning, I decided to leave. I had learned what I needed to. The isolation, the silence, the way the forest could feel like it was closing in, was more powerful than any threat I could see. I packed my belongings, checked the cabin to make sure nothing was missing or damaged, and walked back to my car. The forest seemed different in the light, less oppressive, almost welcoming in a strange way. As I drove back onto the main road, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The cabin was still there, quiet and undisturbed, waiting for the next person. The experience had been terrifying, but it wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost story. It was the raw, unsettling reality of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature that didn't care about me. It taught me to respect the forest, to understand the power of isolation and darkness, and to appreciate the small comforts of safety and light. Looking back, I realized that the fear I had felt wasn't just from the possibility of someone being outside, but from the forest itself, the way it could mask movement, distort sounds, and create shapes from shadows. That knowledge stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile our sense of security really is when we are far from other people. I would never forget that cabin, the oppressive darkness, and the sound of footsteps that might not have been anyone at all. But I left with a clear understanding. The forest is alive, not in a magical sense, but in its ability to make you feel small, vulnerable, and completely alone. And surviving that feeling is an achievement in itself. I drove away, the road curving through the trees, and with every mile, the sense of unease faded. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, sunlight was streaming fully over the hills, warm and reassuring. The cabin was behind me now, but its memory stayed, vivid and sharp. I knew I would return to civilization with a new respect for the wilderness and a deep understanding of what it means to be truly alone in the woods. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I can see the cabin, the shadows pressing against the windows, and hear the faint, deliberate snap of twigs outside. And I remember the relief that came with daylight, the understanding that fear often exists not in what we see, but in what we imagine, magnified by the isolation and silence of the forest around us. It is a lesson that has stayed with me ever since. The cabin was deeper in the woods than I expected, nestled in a clearing that seemed to exist only on old maps. The trees around it were thick, their branches intertwined so tightly that even the midday sun struggled to break through. The path that led to it was little more than a faint trail, overgrown in places, with roots sticking out like the spines of some ancient creature. I had been driving for hours, winding through dirt roads and crossing small streams, until finally, the trail opened up to the cabin. Its wooden exterior was weathered, gray, and rough from decades of rain and snow, but the structure itself was solid. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the faint hum of insects and the distant call of a bird. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing, noticing that the ground was uneven, soft in patches, and slightly muddy from a recent rain. Stepping out, I felt the chill of the forest wrap around me. It wasn't cold, but the damp air seeped into my jacket, and my boots immediately began to pick up bits of mud and pine needles. The cabin had a small porch with a railing that creaked under the weight of my boots. The door was solid oak with rusted hinges, and I had to pull hard to get it open. Inside, the smell of aged wood, dust, and something faintly metallic hit me. There was no furniture except for a table pushed into the corner and a few wooden chairs stacked haphazardly against the wall. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the windows were dusty, streaked with dirt that blurred the view outside. I moved through the cabin, testing each room. One was a small bedroom with a bed frame missing its mattress. Another was a tiny kitchen space with a sink that was clogged and a few broken cabinets. I could see spider webs stretched across the corners of the ceiling and a thick layer of dust on every surface. The air felt stagnant, and I could see my breath in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. I set my bag down on the table and went back outside, feeling the need to stretch my legs and explore the clearing. The clearing itself was roughly circular, surrounded by trees that rose like walls. The grass was overgrown, dotted with patches of moss and small wildflowers. I noticed animal tracks near the edges of the clearing. Deer, maybe, and something larger that I couldn't immediately identify. The forest beyond the clearing was dense, with shadows moving in the corners of my vision whenever I glanced toward the trees. I felt the first edge of unease there, the way the shadows seemed too deep, too still, and too quiet. I shook it off, reminding myself I was here for isolation and the chance to escape the noise of the world, but the feeling lingered. As the sun began to drop, the forest darkened quickly. I started a small fire in a cleared area near the porch, using dry twigs and pine needles I collected from the ground. The fire sputtered at first, but gradually caught, casting a warm glow over the clearing and sending sparks into the darkening sky. I sat on the edge of the porch, watching the flames dance, listening to the crackle of burning wood. The shadows of the trees stretched long and thin, and every small sound seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the distant movement of something through the underbrush. Night came faster than I expected. By the time it was fully dark, the forest felt alive with movement, even though I saw nothing. The cabin, isolated and surrounded by shadow, seemed smaller and more vulnerable. I lit a lantern and carried it inside, setting it on the table. Its dim light flickered across the walls, showing the scratches and imperfections in the wood. Each creak of the cabin's frame sounded like a groan, each shift of the wind outside like someone walking past the window. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that everything I was hearing was natural: animals, wind, the settling of the old wood, but the tension in my chest made it hard to breathe. Around midnight, I decided to sleep. I dragged one of the chairs into the corner of the main room and laid my sleeping bag across it. The chair was unstable, rocking slightly under my weight, but I didn't care enough to find another. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed louder at night: the wind in the trees, the distant crack of a branch, the occasional rustle in the undergrowth. At one point, I heard something moving near the cabin, something heavy, deliberate, and slow. I froze, listening, heart pounding. It stopped. Then I heard it again, a soft thud against the outer wall. I held my breath, straining to see in the darkness, but the lantern was too far to cast light outside. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds ceased, replaced by the normal, distant noises of the forest. I convinced myself it had been a deer or some other animal brushing against the cabin. I forced my eyes closed and finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning came with a gray light, thick clouds hanging low over the trees. I left the cabin, needing fresh air. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, but still dense and isolating. I explored the edges of the clearing, tracing the larger tracks I had seen the previous day. They led to a cluster of trees at the far end, where I found a patch of disturbed ground, flattened in a way that suggested something heavy had lain there. The idea that something had been near the cabin overnight made my stomach tighten, but I rationalized that it had to be a bear or a large deer, nothing more sinister. I spent the day gathering firewood, cleaning the cabin as best I could, and taking notes in a small journal I had brought. I examined the structure, noting the stability of the floorboards, the gaps in the walls, the areas where water had leaked in from the roof. I felt a strange connection to the place, a respect for its age and endurance, even as a part of me remained on edge. The forest seemed to watch me as I worked, every rustle a reminder of the isolation I had sought. That night, I lit the fire again and sat close, making sure it was bigger this time, casting long shadows across the clearing. The sounds came back, more clearly than before. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the firelight. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, bending as though they were aware of me. I gripped a heavy branch nearby, telling myself I would investigate if anything came closer. Hours passed. I stayed awake, eyes locked on the darkness, until the first gray of dawn began to pierce through the trees. The forest grew quiet again, and the tension in my shoulders finally eased. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin. I packed my belongings carefully, noting every detail of the place. Before I left, I walked around the clearing, taking in the tracks again. Something had indeed moved close to the cabin during the night, leaving prints partially obscured by leaves and mud. I traced them to the edge of the forest, seeing signs that a large animal had been feeding or moving in the area. It was unnerving, but also oddly grounding, a reminder that the wilderness was alive and indifferent. I drove away slowly, taking the winding dirt paths back toward the main road. Looking back, the cabin seemed smaller than I remembered, almost hidden beneath the canopy of trees. The clearing, quiet now in the morning light, held no trace of the fear and tension I had felt. The forest seemed calm, almost serene, but I knew better. I knew that at any time, in the depths of that dense woods, the unknown could be moving just beyond sight. By the time I reached the paved road, the forest was behind me, the cabin just another memory. I felt a strange mixture of relief and regret. Relief at leaving the tension and isolation. Regret at leaving a place that had demanded I confront the raw, unfiltered reality of the wilderness. The experience stayed with me, a reminder that nature is vast, unpredictable, and unfeeling, and that isolation can test the limits of endurance, patience, and courage. Even now, months later, I can picture the cabin perfectly, the warped boards, the faint smell of damp wood, the shadows stretching across the clearing at night. I can hear the creak of the porch, the rustle of unseen movement in the trees, the heavy footfalls that may have been nothing more than a bear, or something else entirely. The memory is sharp, vivid, and real. And every time I think about it, I remember the weight of solitude, the necessity of staying alert, and the strange peace that comes from surviving the night in a place that respects neither fear nor comfort, only presence and persistence. I learned that fear doesn't always come from what we imagine. Sometimes it comes from what is real, tangible, and unavoidable, the dark, uncharted corners of the world, and the knowledge that for a few hours or a night or two, you are utterly alone within it. The cabin remains in my memory, not as a place of terror in a storybook sense, but as a place that tested every instinct, every decision, and every ounce of courage. And leaving it, walking back into civilization, I felt a clarity and calm I've never found elsewhere. A reminder that life is full of unknowns, but we are capable of facing them, surviving them, and returning to tell the story. Even now, the thought of that clearing and the forest beyond makes my skin tighten, and I know that if I ever returned, I would tread carefully, respect the space, and remember the lessons it gave me. The cabin, the forest, the sounds, the tracks, all remain engraved in my mind, a vivid testament to the raw, unembellished reality of isolation and the wild. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, far enough from the main road that it felt like it existed in a different world. The trees leaned over the dirt path leading up to it, their branches scraping and creaking with every gust of wind. I had driven in the afternoon, the sun still high, and as I got closer, the air seemed cooler, heavier, and quiet in a way that made me aware of every crunching rock under the tires. The cabin itself was small, made of dark wood, with a steep roof and a stone chimney that looked like it had last been used years ago. The windows were dusty, and the front porch sagged slightly, but it had the charm I was looking for, a place to get away from everything, to escape the noise and the endless responsibilities I'd been carrying for months. The first thing I noticed after stepping out of the car was the smell, the sharp, clean scent of pine mixed with damp earth. The kind of smell that hits your lungs and makes you feel alive, even though it's heavy and thick. I carried my bag up the steps, the boards groaning under my weight. The front door opened with a reluctant creak, and inside the air was cool and musty, like it had been sealed up for a long time. Dust motes floated in the thin streaks of sunlight that pierced through the grime on the windows. The place smelled faintly of wood polish and old smoke, but there was also an underlying dampness that made me wrinkle my nose. The cabin had a small living area with a worn couch, a wooden table with uneven legs, and a tiny kitchen corner with a stovetop that looked barely functional. A staircase in the corner led up to a loft where the bed was tucked under the slanted roof. I set down my bag and walked around, running my fingers over the rough wood of the walls. Everything felt solid, real, tangible, but also isolated. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I could hear a faint creak somewhere in the distance, though I couldn't see it from the cabin. I decided to explore the surrounding area before it got dark. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and towering pines that blocked most of the fading sunlight. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches and wet leaves. Every step I took made a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I followed a narrow trail I found behind the cabin, the path winding up a gentle slope. Small animals scurried away at my approach, squirrels, rabbits, maybe a deer judging by the tracks. The farther I went, the more I felt the quiet pressing in. Not the comfortable quiet of a park or a backyard, but the deep, endless silence of a forest that has no one else in it for miles. As the light began to fade, I noticed the forest closing in around me. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches intertwining overhead so that the remaining sunlight barely touched the ground. Shadows pooled in every hollow, and the trail became harder to follow. At one point, I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, my heart jumping at the sudden noise of my own body moving in the stillness. I laughed softly to calm myself and pushed on, knowing I needed to get back before darkness fully set in. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky had turned a deep indigo. The first stars were visible, scattered faintly across the horizon. Inside, the cabin was darker than I expected. I lit a few candles I had brought, their flickering flames casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees sway as if they were alive. I made a small fire in the stone fireplace, the smell of burning wood filling the cabin and cutting through the musty air. Sitting on the couch, I could feel the warmth of the flames on my face, but I couldn't shake the sensation that the forest was watching. Night fell completely, and the sounds of the forest intensified. Owls called to each other across the darkness, their hoots echoing eerily. The wind gusted through the trees with a low, moaning whistle. Somewhere nearby, an animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, howled its sound long and sorrowful. Each noise made me tense, my body reacting to the isolation. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, that nothing could reach me here, but my mind refused to settle. I went to the loft to sleep, but even with the fire crackling below, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every snapping branch outside, kept me alert. I thought I heard footsteps in the yard, light but deliberate, moving back and forth as if someone was pacing. I froze, straining to listen, but there was only the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. I told myself I was imagining it, that the shadows and the quiet were playing tricks on me. Still, I didn't feel right. I grabbed a flashlight I had packed and kept it beside me, its beam steady and reassuring in the darkness. Around midnight, I woke to a loud noise that made me sit straight up. It sounded like a tree limb snapping, but closer, almost as if something had fallen in the yard. I stayed perfectly still, listening, my ears straining. A long pause followed, and then I heard it, a slow, deliberate rustling, moving along the perimeter of the cabin. It wasn't fast, like an animal fleeing. It was careful, cautious, almost calculated. I kept my eyes on the loft opening, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. My mind raced, imagining what could be out there. A bear, maybe, or a large dog that had gotten loose from somewhere far away. The rational part of me knew it was probably something mundane, but the fear that gripped me felt real and immediate. I sat there for what felt like hours, the sounds moving closer and farther away, circling the cabin. The wind rattled the windows and the door, and every so often, a branch would hit the side of the cabin with a thud that made my heart jump. I kept the flashlight in my hand, its beam cutting through the darkness, searching for movement. I considered going outside to investigate, but realized that would be reckless, possibly dangerous. The forest was dense, the terrain uneven, and I had no way to know what I might encounter in the dark. Eventually, the sounds faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I forced myself to lie down again, though sleep was shallow and uneasy. Every small noise made me flinch. When morning finally came, the light filtering weakly through the windows felt like a relief. I got up, pulled on some clothes, and went outside to survey the area. The forest was calm, the night's tension replaced by the quiet chirping of birds and the rustle of small animals going about their day. I walked around the cabin, checking for signs of what had been moving outside. There were no tracks, no disturbed ground, nothing to indicate that anything had actually been there. Only the marks of fallen branches and leaves moved by the wind. Despite the relief of daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent the next few hours exploring further, following a creek that ran behind the cabin and cutting through the dense forest. The terrain was challenging, the ground slippery and uneven, but the exposure to the light and the natural rhythm of the forest helped calm me. I could see evidence of wildlife everywhere: deer tracks, raccoon prints, even the faint trail of a fox. But none of it carried the deliberate, measured presence that had unnerved me the night before. That night, I stayed alert again, but the sounds were different, more natural, less focused. I realized that the previous night, my mind had been creating patterns, imagining threats where there were none. Still, I kept the flashlight within reach, the fire burning low, and the door locked securely. I learned to trust my instincts, to differentiate between the natural noises of the forest and the imagined ones that my isolation had magnified. Over the next few days, I settled into a rhythm. I collected firewood from the surrounding area, ensuring the fireplace could burn long through the night. I explored more of the trails, noting the creek, the small clearing where sunlight hit the ground in the morning, and a rock formation that jutted out of the hillside, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding forest. The isolation became less intimidating with routine, the nights more manageable as I learned to read the subtle signs of the environment: the direction of the wind, the sounds of wildlife, the way shadows moved with the moonlight. On the last night, I sat by the fire for a long time, letting the flames warm me and listening to the gentle sounds of the forest. The rustle of leaves, the distant bird calls, the faint burble of the creek, all of it felt alive, real, and utterly natural. I realized that the fear I had felt wasn't from anything outside, but from the unknown and the quiet. The forest hadn't changed, I had. I had learned to navigate the silence and solitude, to find comfort in being alone with my thoughts and the natural world. When I packed up to leave the cabin, I took one last walk around the property, noting the sturdy structure, the dense forest, and the subtle signs of life all around. The cabin had given me a harsh but necessary lesson. Fear is often amplified by isolation, and clarity comes with attention and understanding. Driving away, I felt a sense of accomplishment, of having faced uncertainty without succumbing to panic, and of having experienced the forest in a way that few people ever do. The road ahead was long, but I left with the knowledge that I could face solitude and the unknown, and that in the quiet, I could find a clear, steady strength within myself. The memory of that cabin remains vivid. The smell of pine and damp earth, the creaking boards, the flicker of candlelight, and the deep, endless quiet of the forest at night. It was a test of patience, of courage, and of perception. And in the end, I left not scared, but aware, alert, and quietly confident in my ability to handle whatever isolation and uncertainty life might throw my way. The air was crisp when I first drove up the narrow, gravel road leading to the cabin. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the dense pine trees that pressed close on either side. The tires crunched over loose stones, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly at the thought of leaving the city and its constant noise behind. The cabin was tucked into a small clearing, far enough from the main road that it felt like it belonged to the forest rather than any map. Its wooden siding was weathered and gray, the roof slightly sagging in places, but it had a solid, stubborn look, as if it had stood there for decades, impervious to storms and cold winters. I had planned the weekend as a solitary retreat. No phone signal, no internet, just me and the forest. The moment I parked, the smell of pine and damp earth filled the cabin. I swung the car door shut and dragged my backpack inside, boots clumping on the wooden floor. The interior was simple: one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a loft above reached by a narrow ladder. Dust hung in the corners, disturbed only by a few mouse tracks near the edges. I set my bag down and took a long breath. The silence was different from city quiet. It had weight, depth, like it could press against your ears and chest. By the time I unpacked, the light had thinned to a pale orange, streaking through the tall windows. I went outside to gather firewood. The forest around me was thick, darkening rapidly, the trees tall enough that they blocked much of the sky. I collected fallen branches and dry logs, noticing how still the air was except for the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I returned to the cabin and built a fire. The first sparks hissed and flared, catching the kindling, then settled into a warm glow. I sat on the rough wooden floor, leaning back against the wall, listening. That's when I first heard it, a low, dragging sound outside. It was faint at first, almost like a branch scraping across the ground, but there was rhythm to it, a deliberate pace. I froze, straining to hear. Then it stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, moving through the underbrush. Still, I felt my heart rate pick up. As darkness fell, the cabin became a small island of light in the blackness of the forest. Shadows from the fire danced across the walls, stretching and twisting like shapes made by an unseen hand. I tried to focus on the mundane, stacking more wood, checking the cabin windows, making sure the door was latched. But the sound came back. This time it was closer, like someone or something was pacing along the edge of the clearing. My stomach tightened. I thought about stepping outside to check, but the thought of plunging into the dark forest alone made my legs stiffen. I stayed still, listening as the noise faded again. I ate a small dinner, canned beans and a few slices of bread, trying to keep calm. The wind picked up, moaning through the trees, rattling the cabin's loose shutters. Every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind made me tense. I kept glancing at the windows, trying to see any movement outside. There was nothing at first. Then, a shadow flickered just beyond the firelight. Something tall, moving slowly across the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, just a figure, impossibly dark against the black. My breath caught, and I ducked closer to the floor, heart hammering. I realized then that the clearing wasn't as isolated as I had thought. Beyond the tree-line, the forest seemed to fold inward, creating pockets of shadow where a person, or several, could hide without being seen. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the firelight, a large branch swaying, a deer standing upright in the right angle. But deep down, I knew the movement had been deliberate. I decided to ignore it, telling myself that panicking would only make things worse. I stacked more wood for the night, each log hitting the other with a sharp clack that seemed louder than it should have been. The dragging sound started again, slower this time, circling the cabin. I held my breath, imagining the footsteps tracing the perimeter. Then I remembered the hunting knife I kept in my backpack. I fumbled in the dark, pulling it out and gripping it tightly. The metal felt reassuring, cold and heavy in my hand. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. I lay on the floor, knife in hand, listening to every sound. At some point, I drifted into a light sleep, dozing in fits and starts, only to wake every few minutes to a snap of a twig, a whisper of wind, or the skitter of something moving outside. Each sound made my stomach knot, and I found myself scanning the shadows, knife raised. Around midnight, I finally noticed the pattern. The sounds weren't random. There were pauses, long stretches of silence, then deliberate movements. It was like someone was waiting, watching, testing. My mind started racing, thinking of scenarios, burglars, hunters, trespassers, but nothing felt certain. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being observed was undeniable, pressing down like a weight in my chest. I decided I needed to secure the cabin further. I checked the windows, locked the door, stacked furniture against the most accessible points. I even piled a few logs near the door, thinking it would slow someone if they tried to force entry. Then I sat back down, eyes fixed on the window, willing myself to remain calm. Hours dragged by. The forest seemed alive with movement, every sound amplified in the darkness. I realized sleep wasn't coming. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something different. A low, guttural growl, close to the cabin. I froze. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a raccoon. It was a predator, something big. I thought about the stories of mountain lions in the area, coyotes moving in packs. The fire was nearly out, leaving only a thin line of glowing embers. I knew stepping outside would be suicidal. The growl came again, closer this time, as if circling the cabin deliberately. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle tensed. The sound stopped. Then, just as suddenly, it resumed, but But now there was another noise layered on top, the sound of sticks snapping underfoot, slow and careful, moving through the underbrush. Whoever, or whatever, it was close. Too close. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in the small cabin, surrounded by forest that seemed to close in with every passing minute. I waited, frozen, listening. The noises circled the cabin several times, then stopped as abruptly as they had started. I dared not move, imagining eyes in the darkness, catching the slightest motion. I realized then that I had underestimated the forest, underestimated the isolation. The silence afterward was worse than the sounds. It stretched on, pressing against me, filling the cabin with tension. By first light, I had convinced myself that whatever had been out there had finally left. I was trembling, exhausted from the adrenaline and lack of sleep. I lit a small fire, more for courage than warmth, and ate a quick breakfast of cold bread and coffee. Every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. I spent the morning clearing the area immediately around the cabin, trying to get a sense of the terrain, looking for tracks. I found some, large and irregular, not human. My heart sank. Whatever had been circling the cabin was likely still close, maybe watching. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, gathering my things, trying not to make noise. I kept the knife within reach, constantly scanning the shadows. The forest felt alive, each tree a potential hiding place. As I climbed into my car, I felt the weight of every sound, every movement, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting to see if I would leave. Driving down the gravel road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Nothing followed. The road stretched straight, flanked by tall pines, until finally, the first signs of civilization appeared. Power lines, a mailbox, a faint glow of distant lights. I exhaled, relief washing over me. I didn't look back again until I reached the highway. Weeks later, I went back once, during daylight, to gather the things I had left behind. The clearing was empty, silent in a way that almost felt unnatural. The forest seemed to have swallowed the cabin's shadow completely. I found the tracks again, but nothing more. I realized that sometimes the forest doesn't need to act aggressively. The presence alone is enough to make you question everything. That weekend left its mark. I learned to respect isolation, to trust instincts over rationalizations. I never returned to that cabin again. The memory of the dragging steps, the growls, and the circling presence stayed with me for years. A reminder that the forest has its own rules, and human reasoning often doesn't apply. No one else was ever involved. No one came close. It was just me, the cabin, and the vast, watching woods surrounding it, a place where silence can scream, and every shadow has a story. I woke up that morning to the faint smell of wood smoke lingering in the cabin, a smell that had clung to the walls for years. The cabin was small, more of a shack than a house, tucked into a dense patch of forest on the edge of a mountain ridge. Sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy outside, painting the wooden floor with pale, uneven stripes. The boards beneath me creaked with every movement, and the cabin's windows were grimy, streaked with dust and watermarks from previous storms. I could hear the wind outside rattling the loose shingles on the roof, a soft, persistent clattering that made the whole place feel fragile, like it could collapse at any moment. I had planned this trip to escape everything, phones, schedules, people. But now that I was here, the isolation started to feel heavy, almost pressing. The cabin had been empty for months, maybe years. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, judging by the scattered belongings in the corners. An old, rusty kettle on the counter, a cracked mug in the sink, and a stack of newspapers yellowed with age. The fireplace held a layer of ash, the smell of long burned wood still faintly clinging to it. I started a small fire to warm the cabin, the sound of wood crackling a welcome comfort at first, until I noticed the shadows it cast on the walls. They stretched long and distorted, twisting like they had a life of their own. The first day passed slowly. I wandered outside, walking along a barely visible path that led down toward the creek. The forest around me was dense, full of gnarled trees and undergrowth, and the sounds of wildlife were minimal. Birds occasionally chirped, but mostly there was a low hum of wind and the distant rush of water. The path was overgrown in places, roots and fallen branches threatening to trip me with every step. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing where the sunlight broke through, but even here, the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I kept telling myself it was the forest, the trees, nothing more, but the sensation refused to leave. As the sun sank lower, I returned to the cabin and began gathering firewood. That's when I first noticed it, the footprints. Not mine, and not entirely animal. They were deep, heavy impressions in the soft soil near the cabin, partially filled with water from last night's rain. I crouched to examine them, feeling the chill run down my spine. The prints were large, human-sized, and they led straight up to the cabin before disappearing behind a tree. My first thought was another hiker, someone passing through. But then I remembered. The nearest trailhead was over 2 miles away, and I hadn't seen a car or sign of anyone else. My pulse quickened, but I convinced myself it was likely an old track from some previous visitor, and I brushed the feeling aside. That night, the wind picked up. The sound outside became more aggressive, like the trees were groaning under some invisible weight. I sat near the fire, trying to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Every time I looked, the shadows seemed to shift differently, like the branches outside were moving with intent, bending toward the cabin. Then I heard it, a snap of a branch somewhere nearby, distinct and deliberate. I froze, listening. There was nothing else at first, just the wind, until a second snap followed, closer this time. Then silence, thick and suffocating, as if the forest had paused, waiting. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, clutching the mug of cold tea I hadn't touched in hours. Eventually, the fire burned low, and exhaustion dragged me to sleep despite the unease pressing down on my chest. I woke in the early hours to the sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. Not the wind, not the trees. Something soft and wet, a scraping noise that traveled along the outer wood. My heart jumped into my throat. I stayed still, listening, straining in the darkness. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving only the low groan of the wind through the eaves. I told myself it was a raccoon or a deer, maybe just branches rubbing against the siding. But the way it had moved, so purposeful, made that explanation feel hollow. I didn't sleep much after that, keeping the fire alive until the first weak light of dawn seeped through the grime on the windows. During the morning, I inspected the cabin thoroughly. Everything seemed in place except for one detail. The back door had a faint scrape along its frame, as though something had tried to force it open. I remembered locking it the night before. My stomach sank. I went around the perimeter, checking the windows. Most were shut tight, but one at the side had a small crack I was sure hadn't been there before. My mind raced through possibilities. Animals, wind, or someone else entirely. I found it hard to convince myself the forest could be this active without the presence of another human. My sense of safety, already fragile, was starting to unravel. I decided to stay put during the day, keeping the cabin secure. The forest seemed quiet, almost too quiet. When I ventured to the creek to fetch water, I noticed more footprints, fresh ones this time. They led in from the forest, veered around the creek, and vanished into the undergrowth. I felt a cold, tense knot forming in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker was nearby, lost, or maybe it was a hunter. But the footprints didn't resemble a hunting boot. They were bare, human-like, and strangely light, like someone wasn't putting their full weight down. I returned to the cabin, checking the locks repeatedly, feeling a growing pressure in my temples. The forest had become an oppressive presence, a living thing watching from every shadow. That night, I couldn't bear the thought of being alone inside the cabin. I packed a small bag with essentials, a flashlight, matches, a pocket knife, and a water bottle. I prepared myself to leave, thinking about hiking back down the overgrown trail to the main road. But the forest outside was different in the darkness, the path barely visible, twisted by fallen branches and shadows. As I stepped outside to test the terrain, I saw movement. A figure, or at least the shape of one, stood near the tree-line. I froze, barely breathing. It didn't move closer or call out. It just watched, impossibly still. I ducked behind the cabin, heart hammering, and waited. After what felt like 10 minutes, it disappeared into the trees. I didn't see it move, just gone, leaving me alone with the quiet murmur of the wind and the firelight flickering from the cabin window. Sleep was impossible after that. I stayed awake, the knife clutched in my hand, eyes darting to every shadow. When dawn finally arrived, I made a plan to leave immediately. I packed quickly, checking all corners, every window, every door. The cabin felt suffocating now, every creak amplified into a potential threat. The air smelled of damp wood and earth, heavy and oppressive. I stepped outside and started down the trail, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The forest seemed alive, the shadows stretching long, twisting around me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, but I pressed on, adrenaline pushing me past the fatigue that had been building all night. The trail was treacherous. Roots and rocks tore at my boots, and the undergrowth scratched at my arms and face. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Hours passed. I followed the trail until it widened into a faint dirt road, leading eventually to a small clearing where a ranger station sat. I waved my flashlight, calling out. A truck pulled up, the driver's eyes wide with concern when they saw me, disheveled, exhausted, and shaking. I explained briefly, though I didn't need to embellish. My relief was overwhelming as they offered me water, a blanket, and a ride down the mountain. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin, now tiny in the distance, the forest around it dark and foreboding. I didn't stop thinking about the footprints, the noises, and the figure that had watched me. The experience had left a mark, a constant awareness of how fragile safety can be in the wilderness. But leaving the cabin, stepping back into civilization, feeling the warmth of the truck and the reassurance of another human presence, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The forest had held its secrets close, but I had escaped, and that was enough. The cabin faded behind me, a memory of fear and tension, but one I survived, and I knew that the relief of returning to safety was something I would carry with me far longer than the terror itself. The woods would always be there, dense and silent, but I had learned the one undeniable truth. In the wilderness, being cautious, aware, and prepared wasn't just smart. It could be the difference between making it out and becoming just another story whispered by the trees. I reached the highway, and for the first time in days, I felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by the warmth of sunlight on my face, the normal sounds of traffic, and the presence of other people, ordinary and solid, reminding me that safety wasn't a guarantee, but it could be found again if you refused to let go of it. I remember the first time I realized just how small and exposed you can feel in the middle of nowhere. I had been driving for hours on a twisting, two-lane road that seemed to disappear into a dense canopy of pine and fir. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the kind of silence that comes from being far from civilization pressed on my ears. I wasn't entirely sure why I had chosen that cabin. It was advertised as remote and peaceful, tucked away in a national forest, ideal for a weekend of writing and solitude. On paper, it sounded perfect. In reality, I had underestimated just how isolated it truly was. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that had long ago begun to reclaim itself. Potholes and ruts had formed pools of dark, murky water from last week's rain. The tires of my car sank slightly each time I passed through one, and I could feel the tension building with every turn of the wheel. When I finally reached it, the place looked like it belonged to a completely different era. Weathered cedar siding, a steep, shingled roof with some shingles missing, and a stone chimney that had long since gone unused. The front porch sagged in the middle, and I had to step carefully over a loose board to get inside. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood, old smoke, and the faint, musty odor of someone or something, having passed through and left traces behind. The air was still, thick, almost tangible in its heaviness. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the floor creaked with every cautious step I took. I had only brought minimal supplies, thinking I would be comfortable enough with a small pile of firewood, canned food, and water. I set my bag down in the living area and ran my hand over the rough surface of the kitchen table. It was covered with scratches and stains, evidence of years of use and neglect. The only window in the room looked out onto the surrounding trees, which were so close that their branches nearly touched the cabin walls. By evening, the forest was beginning to darken in a way that made the cabin feel like a tiny island in a sea of shadow. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace to take the chill off. The matches struck quickly, and soon the flames were dancing against the stone, giving the room a flickering warmth. It felt comforting for a moment, the kind of warmth that makes you think the world outside is quiet and manageable. But outside, the wind picked up, rattling the edges of the windows and sending shadows of swaying branches across the walls. Every gust sounded like a low, drawn-out groan, and I found myself glancing at the door more often than necessary. I tried to distract myself by unpacking the few items I had brought. Food, notebooks, pens, a small lantern. My phone barely worked, a single bar if I stood on the porch and stretched my arm just right. I didn't really care, I had come for isolation after all. But it was unsettling not to know if anyone could reach me if something went wrong. The sun disappeared completely, and the forest around the cabin became a wall of black. The wind was constant now, and with it came a variety of unfamiliar sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling in patterns that didn't seem entirely natural, and the occasional low-throated grunt that I tried to convince myself belonged to deer or some other wildlife. At some point, I realized the fire was dying, and I didn't have much wood left. I got up to fetch more from the pile outside. The wind had picked up even more, blowing snow, or maybe it was just frost, against the cabin in gusts that sounded like scraping metal. As soon as I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a wall, sharp and biting. I grabbed the next stack of logs and turned to head back inside when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow between the trees, moving slowly and deliberately. I froze, unsure whether it was an animal or something else. The forest was deep, and the shadows cast by the moonlight made shapes dance and stretch in ways that were almost impossible to read. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe just the wind twisting branches, but my stomach twisted into a tight knot anyway. I hurried back inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I leaned against the wood, listening to the storm, or whatever it was outside. The sounds of movement persisted, faint but undeniable. Something large was out there, moving in a calculated way. I had no weapons, no way of defending myself except for the flimsy door and my own presence. I kept telling myself it was a bear, or a deer, or some animal curious about the cabin. Still, the feeling of being watched was oppressive. I built the fire back up as best I could and stayed close, the flames my only comfort. Night stretched on. The wind howled, banging against the walls, making the cabin groan and shudder. Every sound made me jump, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of air through a gap in the window, the thump of something heavy landing on the forest floor outside. At one point, a distinct sound made my blood run cold. The soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the snow, moving closer to the cabin. My first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide in that small space. I had to keep moving, stay alert. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, the only thing with any weight to it, and held it loosely, more for comfort than for actual protection. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity. I didn't sleep. I stayed close to the fire, listening. Sometimes the footsteps stopped, sometimes they circled, and every now and then a tree branch would snap, almost as if something massive had collided with it. My mind kept running scenarios, none of them comforting. I considered trying to leave, but the storm outside had grown violent. Snow whipped horizontally across the landscape, visibility reduced to a few feet. The dirt road was likely impassable. I was trapped in the cabin with something, or possibly someone, watching from the darkness. By the early morning, the storm had lessened. The forest was quieter, the wind reduced to intermittent gusts that rattled the cabin like distant echoes. Exhausted but still alert, I cautiously stepped outside to assess the situation. The snow was deep, covering the ground and the path back to the road. Tracks surrounded the cabin, large, unmistakably human. Someone had walked around the entire perimeter during the night. There were no footprints leading away, only the ones around me. I felt a chill unrelated to the cold. Whoever, or whatever, had been outside had left its mark, and the thought of crossing that forest alone in daylight was terrifying. I spent the morning preparing. I gathered as much firewood as I could, reinforced the door with a makeshift brace from a fallen chair, and packed my bag with essentials. Every shadow seemed exaggerated, every sound amplified. I stayed vigilant, even as the sun rose higher, revealing the forest in stark, detailed clarity. I saw the tracks more clearly now, their size and spacing unmistakable. An adult male, large build, careful in every step. There were no other signs, no discarded items, no weapon, nothing. But the sense of being observed lingered like a weight pressing on my chest. When I finally decided I couldn't stay another night, I made a plan to leave. I waited for the storm to retreat fully, ensuring the road was navigable. With my bag slung over my shoulder and the knife still in hand, I moved cautiously, keeping my eyes on the tree-line. Every step on the snow was loud, my breath visible in the frigid air. I didn't dare look back, even though the urge was almost overwhelming. The cabin faded behind me, a small, battered silhouette against the dense forest. I kept walking, following the ruts in the road, until finally the trees began to thin. Hours later, I reached the main road, where my car had been parked along the shoulder, half buried in snow. My hands shook as I slid into the driver's seat, fumbling to start the engine. The heater kicked in, warm air washing over me, but it did little to ease the tension coiling in my muscles. I drove for hours, unwilling to stop until I reached a small town. I checked into a motel, not speaking to anyone, barely eating. Sleep came eventually, but it was shallow and fragmented, haunted by the memory of the tracks, the footsteps, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Even weeks later, the image of that cabin and the forest around it stayed with me. Every time I think about going back, my stomach tightens. I realize that isolation is not always peaceful. Sometimes it is exposure in its purest form, vulnerable, raw, and inescapable. The cabin was meant to be a retreat, a place to find quiet and focus. Instead, it had been a reminder that in the wild, there are boundaries and presences you cannot control, and the world outside the safety of doors and walls can feel as threatening as anything you imagine. I never returned to that forest. The cabin remains somewhere in the trees, silent and abandoned, a place that holds the memory of that long, cold night when I truly understood what fear felt like. And I know that while the cabin itself is inanimate, the experience of being utterly alone in a place designed for solitude has a weight that never leaves you. Every time I hear wind rattling through a nearby forest or snow crunching underfoot, I am reminded of it, and it keeps me cautious, alert, and aware of just how fragile a sense of safety can be when it is stripped away completely. I remember the drive up to the cabin like it was yesterday, even though it was years ago. The road was nothing more than a winding dirt path that cut through thick forest on both sides. The sun was setting when I arrived, and long shadows stretched across the ground, making every tree look like a towering, menacing figure. The cabin itself was tucked away at the end of a small clearing, almost hidden by overgrown pine and oak. From the outside, it looked quaint, even inviting, with its weathered wooden walls and a small porch that sagged slightly in the middle. But there was something about the way the wind moved through the trees that made it feel isolated in a way I hadn't fully grasped until I stepped out of the car. The air was dense and sharp, smelling of wet earth and pine resin, and it carried a quiet that was almost oppressive, as if the forest was holding its breath. The cabin door creaked when I opened it, and I was greeted by the stale scent of wood that had soaked up years of damp air. Dust motes floated in the last rays of sunlight slipping through the windows. The interior was small and compact. There was a low ceiling with thick wooden beams that had darkened over time, and the floorboards were uneven, creaking under every step. A fireplace dominated one wall, its blackened stones a reminder of fires that had burned long ago. The furniture was minimal, a couple of wooden chairs, a small table, and a narrow bed pushed into the corner. There was a faint chill in the air, even though I hadn't even stepped fully inside yet. I spent the first hour walking through the cabin, checking the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Outside, the forest seemed calm, but it wasn't the calm of a sunny day in a park. It was the kind of calm that feels heavy, like the air itself is watching you. As darkness fell, the forest became a wall of black, the trees blending together until I couldn't see anything past the first few yards. I lit the fireplace and tried to make the cabin feel more like home, arranging the small pile of firewood I had brought, listening to the way the flames crackled and hissed as they licked the old logs. The shadows the fire cast danced along the walls, turning ordinary objects into shapes that my mind instantly recognized as threats. Every sound from the outside, the snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the soft thump of something hitting the ground, made me freeze and listen. By nightfall, the full weight of isolation had settled in. I realized there was no road nearby that cars could use, no neighbors, nothing but forest in every direction. I hadn't heard a human voice since I arrived, and even the occasional bird or insect seemed to have fallen silent. The wind began to pick up, rattling the cabin windows, and for the first time I noticed just how much the cabin itself groaned and shifted as it settled. I kept telling myself it was just old wood, nothing more, but the sound was eerie, long and hollow, like the house was breathing. I tried to read, to distract myself, but every rustle outside made me look up. Every shadow on the wall made me tense. Around midnight, the real fear started. I heard a faint scratching at one of the windows facing the forest. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the glass, but then it happened again, slow, deliberate, and heavier this time. My pulse jumped. The scratching didn't follow a random pattern like a branch swaying in the wind. It seemed methodical. I stood frozen, staring at the dark forest beyond the glass. The wind died for a moment, and everything was silent. Then came the thump, a heavy, muffled sound against the wooden wall of the cabin. Not a branch, not an animal that moved like a deer or a raccoon, something larger, heavier. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A bear? Maybe. But the sound repeated, coming closer each time, moving around the cabin in a pattern that made me certain it was tracking me. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and shone it out the window, trying to catch movement. The beam cut through the black, lighting up nothing but trees and underbrush. I scanned around, heart pounding, every instinct screaming that I wasn't alone, even though logically I told myself the forest was full of animals and nothing more. But the way the sound moved, deliberate and patient, didn't belong to any animal I knew. It circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise itself. My chest tightened, and I realized I had been holding my breath, listening to every creak and crack of the old wood. Hours passed in that tension, every minor noise amplified. I kept the fire burning as long as I could, shoving more wood onto the flames to create light and warmth, trying to convince myself that I wasn't being hunted by something intelligent. Occasionally, I heard the soft crunch of leaves or pine needles outside. My mind imagined footsteps pacing, watching, waiting. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, light brought some relief. Sunlight spilled through the windows, and I could finally see the forest in daylight. The previous night's terror didn't vanish entirely, but I felt safer. I stepped outside carefully, looking for signs of whatever had circled the cabin. That's when I noticed the tracks in the damp soil, large and uneven, moving in a semicircle around the cabin. They weren't human, but they were too big to be a deer. I followed them cautiously, sticking to the edges of the clearing. The tracks disappeared into the forest, vanishing as though whoever, or whatever, had melted back into the trees. I stayed alert, walking the perimeter, examining broken branches and disturbed undergrowth. Everything pointed to a creature that was aware of me, aware of the cabin, but careful enough not to reveal itself fully. I spent the next day repairing the cabin's weak points, making sure windows and doors were secure, piling extra wood near the walls, and making noise deliberately to mark my presence. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the leaves had my muscles tense. By evening, I had barricaded myself inside as best I could. I lit the fire, gathered all my tools and makeshift weapons, and resolved to wait out the night. That second night was worse. The creature, or person, outside tested the cabin's defenses. I heard scratching at the door, loud thumps against the walls, and occasionally a heavy step that made the floorboards tremble. I could tell it was walking deliberately, pausing at corners, circling, assessing. My fear was sharp, stabbing, but it was tempered by a clear sense. I needed to survive until daylight. I stayed awake, listening, watching, heart pounding for hours. At dawn, the sound stopped. I didn't hear anything moving outside. When I finally ventured out, I discovered something terrifyingly clear. The tracks from the night before were gone, but the earth around the cabin had been disturbed, with deep gouges in the dirt and broken branches forming a rough circle around the structure. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had clearly been studying the cabin. The realization hit me fully. I had been under surveillance, completely alone, with nothing between me and danger but thin wooden walls. Over the next few days, I remained vigilant. I stayed mostly inside, exploring the cabin only during daylight. I mapped the surrounding forest as best I could, noting signs of movement, animal paths, and possible hiding places. Eventually, I realized the pattern. The creature stayed at the edges of the clearing, rarely venturing closer in daylight, but it had circled the cabin repeatedly at night, sometimes close enough that I could hear its breathing through the thin wood. I learned to move quietly, to watch for subtle signs, and to trust my instincts. By the end of the week, I had adapted to the cabin and the forest. I could anticipate sounds, interpret movements, and recognize the subtle signs of the creature's presence. I never saw it directly, but I knew it was there, intelligent and patient. When I finally left, driving back down the dirt road as the sun rose behind me, I felt a strange mix of relief and respect. I had survived, but the memory of the night spent listening, waiting, and calculating every movement haunted me long after. The cabin still sits there, deep in the forest, silent by day, mysterious and watchful by night, and I know that if anyone were to stay there now, they would feel it too. The quiet, the isolation, and the patient awareness of something larger than themselves lurking just beyond the walls. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and hear the wind in the trees, the creak of the cabin, and the faint, deliberate scratch of something circling, waiting. I survived because I learned to respect the forest, the cabin, and the hidden eyes that watched me. And I understand now that true fear isn't in ghosts or fairy tales. It's in the silent, deliberate presence of something very real, just beyond your line of sight, patient and watching. The air hit me first, thick and heavy with the damp smell of pine and decaying leaves. I had driven hours to reach this cabin, isolated deep in the mountains where cell service flickered like a candle about to go out. The road was nothing more than a narrow, winding track, its edges overgrown with brambles and tall grass. I had parked my car on a small clearing just beyond a sharp curve, where the gravel had been packed down by years of infrequent visitors. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and silent, the only movement coming from the occasional flicker of leaves in the wind. I stepped out, feeling the immediate drop in temperature as shadows clung to every crevice, and I noticed how quiet it was, almost too quiet, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. The cabin was old, built from thick logs darkened with age and weather. Moss had claimed the roof in patches, and some shingles were missing entirely. A thin chimney jutted out crookedly, and I could see blackened streaks along the wood where smoke had once escaped. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the steps creaked under my weight. I ran my hand along the rough wood of the railing, feeling splinters dig into my palm. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and a faint sourness that hinted at moisture trapped somewhere unseen. The floorboards groaned under every step. I flicked on the single overhead light, a weak bulb that cast more shadows than it eliminated, and it revealed a small room with a stone fireplace, a table with a few scattered chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. A thin layer of dust covered everything, except for a few strange, circular marks on the floor near the door, which I assumed were from previous visitors. I set down my bag and began to explore. The kitchen was tiny, with a rusty sink and a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The fridge hummed weakly, and I imagined it probably didn't work. There were cupboards, mostly empty, but I found a few cans of beans and a half-full bag of rice, which I set aside for later. The windows were grimy and streaked with dirt, the kind of grime that makes everything outside look distorted, dreamlike. I opened one and leaned out, staring at the thick trees that pressed in from every side. The sun was beginning to set, and the last light painted the forest in dull oranges and purples. Shadows pooled around the trunks, and I realized that if someone, or something, was out there, it could easily watch me without me seeing it. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. The kindling was damp and smelled of rot, but after much struggle, I got a small flame going, feeding it piece by piece. The fire slowly grew, the warmth pushing against the chill that had settled into my bones. I sat back in one of the chairs, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest, branches cracking under their own weight, leaves rustling in the wind, distant birds calling before they settled for the night. Time passed quietly, the cabin growing darker as the light from the fire began to dominate the room. The shadows it cast were long and twitching, following every plank of the cabin's walls. I tried to focus on normal things, like checking the supplies and making sure the locks on the doors were secure, but every creak and groan of the cabin, under its own weight, made my stomach tighten. Night fell fully, and with it came a deeper silence. The wind had died down, leaving only the occasional snap of a branch, close enough to make me flinch each time. I sat near the fire, trying to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, half expecting to see movement. That's when I noticed it, a faint, slow shuffle outside, just beyond the dim reach of the firelight. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The sound didn't repeat immediately, but then it came again, closer this time. Footsteps? Or something dragging? I couldn't tell. I rose quietly and crept to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. The forest beyond was black, almost impenetrable, but I thought I saw a figure, or at least the shape of one, moving between the trees. It didn't run, didn't make noise, just shifted steadily, methodically. I stepped back, telling myself it was a deer or some other animal. The forest was full of wildlife, and it was easy for the mind to play tricks in low light. But then the sound came again, this time from the side of the cabin. Something brushed against the wood outside. A low, dragging noise that sent a shiver down my spine. My rational mind screamed it had to be a fallen branch, but instinct told me otherwise. I grabbed a flashlight, checking that the batteries worked, and tried to peer outside. The beam cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating only the base of a tree and a patch of forest floor covered in leaves. Nothing moved. I waited, my pulse racing, ears straining. Minutes passed. Then came another sound, unmistakably deliberate, a soft, heavy thump against the porch. Someone was there. Or something. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, that maybe an animal had jumped up, but the thump came again, closer this time, and then a faint scrape along the wood. My breath caught. I considered leaving, but my car was parked down the small clearing, and the thought of stumbling through the dark forest without knowing what was out there was worse. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, feeling the cold metal in my hand, and edged toward the door. My ears picked up every detail, the faint rustle of leaves, the crunch of gravel, the whisper of wind through the trees. I reached the door, pressed my back against it, and listened. Silence followed for a moment, and I thought maybe the sound had moved on. I took a cautious step outside, the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The night air was colder than I expected, biting at my cheeks. I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I let out a shaky breath and started walking toward the car, my steps light but hurried. The gravel crunched sharply under my feet. I glanced back once and saw a shadow shift near the edge of the forest. I ran the last few steps to the car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, loud and solid against the oppressive silence. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the narrow road, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. But I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a flash of movement, something large and low, retreating into the black of the trees. My chest heaved. I drove without pause, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles hurt. By the time I reached the main road, the forest had disappeared behind me, replaced by faintly lit stretches of asphalt. My heart slowly began to settle, though the adrenaline still buzzed through my veins. I stopped at a gas station several miles down, bought water, and forced myself to sit for a while. I kept thinking about the cabin, the strange sounds, and the deliberate movements I had seen or imagined. I told myself over and over that the forest was full of animals, that the night plays tricks on your mind, that isolation amplifies fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the certainty that something had been tracking my movements outside the cabin. I drove until the sun began to rise, casting everything in soft, pale light. The mountains that had seemed foreboding in the dark now appeared peaceful and quiet, their peaks dusted with early morning frost. I stopped at a small overlook, just to catch my breath, and looked back at the path I had come from. The clearing where the cabin sat was gone in the distance, swallowed by the trees. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney, and I realized it had been empty all night, abandoned in a way that made the presence I had felt even more unsettling. Weeks later, I returned with a friend during the day to check the cabin again. It was exactly as I had left it, except there were new footprints in the mud outside. Human footprints, unmistakably. They led to the forest and vanished. There was no one around. The marks near the door inside were fresh, too. I realized then that whatever had been outside that night hadn't been an animal, and the thought lingered longer than any rational explanation could chase away. I never stayed there again. I never felt the need to test the silence of that forest or the isolation of that cabin. The memory of the dragging sound, the thumps on the porch, and the shadow among the trees stayed with me, a constant reminder that some places hold a presence you can feel even when nothing is visible. The cabin was quiet now in the daylight, but I knew what had been there, and I knew it was waiting for the next person foolish enough to come alone. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to tilt low behind the trees. The gravel road had been a narrow, twisting trail for miles, bordered by dense forest on both sides. I had driven slowly, aware that a wrong turn could have left me stranded in the wilderness for hours. The cabin itself was isolated, perched on a small clearing surrounded by thick pine and oak. It was old, built from rough-hewn logs, the roof sagging slightly in the center, and the wooden porch boards creaking underfoot as I stepped out of the car. The place had a smell of damp wood, dust, and the faint tang of mildew, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it again after years of neglect. Inside, The air was musty but not unpleasant. The cabin had a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end and a small kitchen area at the other. A staircase led to a loft above, which I assumed was the sleeping area. The furniture was sparse: a battered couch, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a few shelves holding a scattering of old cooking utensils and canned goods. Light filtered through the grimy windows, creating sharp contrasts across the floorboards. I set down my bag and started to explore, making mental notes of the state of the cabin, checking the locks on the doors and windows, and testing the fireplace. The chimney seemed intact, though it was clearly long and used. I decided I would need to sweep it before lighting a fire. By the time I had finished inspecting the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The forest outside turned almost black, the last traces of daylight vanishing into deep shadows. I lit a lantern, placing it on the table, and prepared a simple dinner with the supplies I had brought. The sounds of the forest at night became clearer as darkness settled. Leaves rustled with the movements of small animals, branches cracked under the weight of squirrels or raccoons, and the wind carried occasional whines and whistles that I couldn't immediately identify. The isolation made every sound more pronounced. After eating, I decided to take a walk around the clearing to stretch my legs. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen branches and patches of thick undergrowth. The moon had risen high enough to give some light, but the shadows between the trees were long and deep. I felt exposed, as if the forest itself was watching. I made a mental note to stay within the clearing after dark, but curiosity drew me closer to the tree-line. Something in the movement of the branches caught my eye, a shape slipping between the trees, quick and low. I paused, heart hammering, and tried to focus. The shadows were dense, but the movement seemed deliberate, not like that of a deer or a raccoon. It vanished as suddenly as it appeared. I returned to the cabin, convincing myself it was just an animal or a trick of the light. I double-checked the doors, secured the windows, and settled on the couch with a blanket. I tried to read, but the rustling outside kept drawing my attention. It was constant, closer now, with a subtle crunching that suggested something heavy was moving through the underbrush. I sat very still, listening, straining to hear more. Then I realized the sounds were circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The cold night air hit me, sharp and biting. I swept the beam across the clearing, revealing nothing but empty trees and darkness. No eyes reflecting in the light, no figure, nothing. Yet the sounds continued, always moving, sometimes stopping, then resuming in another direction. I began to pace, my mind racing through possibilities. A bear, a pack of coyotes, or perhaps someone else in the woods. The thought of another person being here made my stomach tighten. I had told no one where I was going. There was no reason for anyone to be here. The minutes stretched long. I returned inside and barricaded the door as best I could with the heavy table pushed against it. I kept the lantern close, ready to grab a heavier object if needed. Every shadow in the cabin seemed alive. A gust of wind rattled the windows, making me flinch. My flashlight's beam danced across the walls as I swept it over the room again and again. The noises outside continued, now accompanied by a faint snapping sound, like twigs breaking underfoot in short, uneven bursts. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined movement in the shadows, the presence of someone just beyond the edge of light. Around midnight, I decided I could not sit still any longer. I needed to know what was out there, to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I grabbed my coat, boots, and a small hatchet for protection, and stepped outside once more. The cold air stung my face. My flashlight's beam carved a narrow path through the darkness, revealing only trees, the uneven ground, and the occasional glint of a wet branch. As I moved around the cabin, I began marking a rough mental map. The sounds had settled into a pattern, moving through certain parts of the forest repeatedly. I noticed broken branches and disturbed leaves, footprints in the soft mud near the edge of the clearing. Too large for any deer I knew, irregular, possibly human. My pulse quickened. Whoever or whatever had been circling the cabin had left evidence now. I considered leaving, but my car was on the narrow road half a mile away, and the forest seemed thicker at night, making it almost impossible to navigate blindly. I returned to the cabin and reinforced the doors, then decided to climb into the loft. It felt safer up there, away from the ground, with a better vantage point through the small windows. I piled chairs and boxes under the loft ladder, making it more difficult to access. Hours passed. The sounds outside waxed and waned, sometimes almost stopping, sometimes circling again. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I dozed lightly, listening for any disturbance. At first light, I descended to find that the forest was calm, the noises of the previous night reduced to normal morning sounds of birds and small animals. The footprints were gone, as if whoever, or whatever, had been there had disappeared with the night. I decided to spend the day inspecting the surrounding forest carefully. I found signs of recent human activity. A small, camouflaged trail leading into the woods, discarded wrappers, and a makeshift campsite a few hundred meters from the cabin. It seemed abandoned, though, with no one present. Whoever had been circling the cabin had used this trail. My unease grew, but I was relieved to have evidence that it was likely a person, not some animal. I spent the day preparing better defenses, blocking windows from the inside with heavy furniture, placing makeshift alarms from cans and string around the perimeter, and keeping my hatchet and flashlight close at hand. By nightfall, I had a plan in case someone tried to approach. The forest seemed quieter, almost holding its breath. I could see the road from the porch now, which gave me some comfort. The second night was long but different. I stayed alert, scanning constantly. At one point, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint moonlight. I held my breath, ready to call out or strike if necessary. But the figure hesitated, then turned and disappeared back into the woods. I realized this person had been observing the cabin, and I had been equally cautious, outwitting each other without confrontation. By morning, I made my decision. I packed my belongings quickly and locked the cabin securely behind me. I followed the road back to my car, leaving the forest and the small clearing behind. The sun was fully up, lighting the trees and clearing, making it appear serene and harmless. The isolation that had felt so threatening at night now seemed peaceful, almost beautiful. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and curiosity. Whoever had been out there had retreated, and I had survived, but the thought lingered. I would return one day, perhaps with friends or with more preparation. But for now, I had my story, my caution, and my memory of a night when the forest felt alive in ways I had never imagined. The cabin still stood, quiet, waiting for someone to notice it again. And I knew if I ever returned, I would be ready. The experience left me with a heightened awareness, an understanding of how vulnerable isolation can make you feel. I replayed every sound, every movement, every shadow in my mind, learning to trust my instincts and respect the wilderness. The forest had not been supernatural, and there were no fairy tales at play. Just human presence, the raw tension of isolation, and the subtle terror of the unknown. In the end, I walked away unharmed, aware, and stronger, carrying the memory with me in vivid detail. I drove up the narrow dirt road as the late afternoon sun was starting to sink behind the trees. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely touched the ground, and the road seemed to wind endlessly without any sign of life beyond the occasional bird or squirrel. The cabin was tucked back a few hundred meters from the road, partially hidden by a stand of pines and oaks. Its wooden walls were darkened with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. I had rented it for a week to get away from everything, work, people, noise, but as I pulled up and cut the engine, a quiet unease settled over me that I couldn't quite shake. The kind of quiet that felt like it was watching. The cabin looked abandoned from the outside, but the smell of must and old wood inside was not unpleasant. It was just old. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight coming through the windows. I ran my fingers over the table and counters, feeling the grain of the wood and noticing tiny cracks and scratches. The floor creaked under my weight, and every step echoed in the empty space. I could see the corners were shadowed, and at first I thought it was just the light, but some shadows seemed to move slightly as if the air itself was pulling them along. I shook my head and set my backpack down, trying to focus on something practical. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. It wasn't strong, just enough to make a soft susurration that filled the forest. I unpacked my things slowly, setting my clothes and food in the small cabinets, checking the tiny fridge, and lighting a few candles I had brought. The electricity worked, but the switches clicked loudly and the bulbs flickered when turned on. That only added to the feeling of isolation, as if the cabin itself was reminding me I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. As evening fell, the shadows deepened, and the forest outside seemed to grow darker and heavier. The smell of damp earth and pine grew stronger, almost choking at times. I stepped outside to stretch my legs, noticing how quiet it was. Not the calm quiet of a peaceful forest, but a weighty silence that pressed in from all sides. No birds, no insects, nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. I walked a short path around the cabin, trying to see if there was any sign of a neighbor or another property nearby, but there was nothing. Only trees, dense and dark, as far as I could see. I returned inside and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The flames crackled and sent sparks up the chimney, giving the room a warm glow. I sat in an old chair near the fire, listening to the wind outside, and tried to relax. But I couldn't stop glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone, or something, just standing there. Hours passed, and the fire dwindled, leaving the room half lit and cold. My eyelids grew heavy, and I decided to sleep, though I left a candle burning just in case. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the noise was rhythmic, deliberate. A crunching, like footsteps, but slow, measured, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. The wooden floorboards outside groaned slightly, and then the noise stopped. My pulse raced. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but the sound was too heavy for small creatures. Too precise. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every small noise made me tense. The hiss of a branch snapping, the rustle of leaves, even the wind shifting against the walls. I stayed by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, watching the darkness outside as best I could. When dawn came, it brought little relief. The forest was still oppressive, still dense, but at least I could see it in the light. I went outside, circling the cabin to see if there were any signs of an animal or person, but found nothing, only footprints in the soft dirt, which I immediately dismissed as my own from the day before. The next night was worse. I had thought the sounds were a one-time thing, a fluke of imagination and an overactive imagination in the dark, but as darkness fell again, I heard them return. Crunch, pause, shuffle, pause. I could hear it circling the cabin, slow and careful, sometimes stopping, then moving again. I stayed inside, trying to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, closer to the walls. At one point, I was certain I could hear a faint scratching, like nails against wood. My stomach dropped. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Even though the locks were old and slightly rusted, I felt safer knowing that at least the doors were closed. I stayed awake all night again. My candle burned down to a stub, my firewood was low, and I barely moved from the chair. In the morning, I went outside and examined the perimeter once more. Near the back of the cabin, I found deep footprints in the soft earth. Larger than human, but not impossibly so. I froze. They were fresh, and they led around the cabin in a wide arc, disappearing into the forest. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to calm down. Whatever it was, it hadn't tried to enter, and I could see no sign of attempts to force doors or windows. I spent the day preparing. I moved furniture to block the windows I could reach, set up makeshift noise traps with cans and stones that would rattle if touched, and made sure I had my phone and keys close by. The sun dipped low behind the trees again, and the shadows stretched across the cabin. I lit a strong fire, stacked my limited firewood nearby, and stayed vigilant. The first footsteps came just after twilight. Crunch, shuffle, pause. I watched through a window, the fire casting flickering light outside. The footprints appeared at the edge of the clearing, and a large, dark shape moved slowly between the trees, circling the cabin. I caught glimpses of it, tall, broad, moving carefully, deliberately aware of my presence. Night after night, the pattern repeated. I began to notice small signs of intelligence, too. Broken branches carefully placed to mark paths, deeper impressions in the ground that suggested it was checking doors or windows, and occasional faint scratches on the wood. The creature, or person, was patient, almost methodical. I realized I couldn't confront it. There was no way I could match whatever strength or stealth it possessed. I had to wait for a safe chance to leave. On the fourth night, I made a plan. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping my fire lit, but I prepared a route to the road, noting every obstacle and area of cover. I waited until the shape moved far enough around the cabin to the far edge of the clearing, then slipped out the back door, moving low and fast toward the road. Every step was careful, deliberate. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me, the shadows thick, the ground soft beneath my boots. My heart pounded, and I could hear the shape moving again, but I kept going, using trees and underbrush to hide my path. I reached the road just as dawn was breaking, the pale light filtering through the trees. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept moving, walking quickly until I hit a main gravel road. Eventually, I saw a truck coming, and I flagged it down, breathless and shaking. The driver stopped without question, letting me climb in, and I gave them the address of the nearest town. As the truck drove away from the cabin, I looked back once. The forest behind it seemed calm again, almost ordinary, but I knew better. Something had been watching, calculating, waiting. I never went back. The cabin was beautiful in the light of day, the forest peaceful and inviting, but I couldn't shake the memory of those nights. Even now, thinking back, I can feel the weight of the silence, the deliberate steps in the dirt, the sense that something was out there just beyond the edge of sight, aware of me. I told myself it was likely a large wild animal, a bear or something similar, but the footprints, the scratches, the careful circling, none of it matched any bear I had ever seen. Months later, I learned that several cabins in the area had been broken into by a skilled poacher or survivalist, someone who moved silently, observed, and knew the forest well. No one had been hurt, but the cabins had signs of methodical exploration, doors checked, paths mapped. Everything matched what I had experienced. I realized then that I had been lucky. If I hadn't stayed alert, had made a wrong move, I might not have made it out that first week. The memory stayed with me, sharp and visceral. Even now, when I walk through a forest or hear footsteps in the dark, I feel that same tension. The knowledge that some things in the woods are patient, calculated, and waiting, and that survival sometimes comes down to staying still, staying quiet, and trusting your instincts above all else. I remember driving down the long, winding dirt road that led to the cabin. The trees were tall and dense on either side, their branches arching over the path, creating a tunnel that swallowed up most of the sunlight. It was late afternoon, and the air had a heavy, earthy smell from the recent rain. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves above me and the occasional crack of a distant branch snapping under its own weight. The cabin had been rented through a small local agency, the kind that specializes in remote properties, and the pictures online had made it look cozy, secluded, and inviting. In reality, it felt much more isolated than I had anticipated. The drive had been longer than I expected, with the GPS cutting out halfway through and me relying on rough paper directions scribbled by the rental agency. The first thing that struck me when I arrived was the silence. No cars, no distant voices, no hum of electricity. Even the wind seemed muted under the canopy of trees. The cabin itself was modest, a simple wooden structure with dark-stained logs, a pitched roof, and a small stone chimney. A thin wisp of smoke curled from it, suggesting it had been used recently, though the place appeared deserted when I walked up. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine, damp earth, and moss. As I set down my bag and looked around, I noticed the surrounding forest seemed unnervingly still. There was no movement, no birds, nothing, just the heavy weight of quiet pressing in from every side. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by the fading sunlight streaming through dirt-smudged windows. Dust covered the wooden floors and furniture, and the air had that distinctive musty smell of an unused space. The main room was small, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a few worn chairs scattered around, and a wooden table in the center. The kitchen was equally sparse, a small counter, a few cabinets with basic utensils, a sink, and a tiny stove. A hallway led to two bedrooms, both furnished with old mattresses and blankets that looked freshly laundered, though their age showed. There was no running water, only a large barrel in the corner that smelled faintly of chlorine. The cabin had electricity, but only a single, weak light bulb flickered on in the main room. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake the creeping feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The isolation was one thing, but there was something more, subtle and indefinable, in the way the shadows clung to the corners of the rooms and the forest pressed close to the cabin walls. I lit the fireplace and stacked some wood, listening to the sharp crackle as the flames took hold. The warmth was comforting, but the shadows only deepened, dancing along the walls in uneven, unpredictable patterns. Outside, the wind rustled the treetops, sending a series of soft, hollow knocks against the cabin walls, like distant fists rapping at a door. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest outside was black, and the thick canopy blocked the moonlight almost entirely. I went outside briefly, flashlight in hand, to take in the area. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves and twigs. I could barely make out the outlines of other trees beyond the small clearing around the cabin. It was so quiet that my own breathing sounded loud, echoing in the darkness. I stayed outside only a few minutes before returning to the warmth of the fire. As the night deepened, strange noises began. At first, it was the familiar sounds of the forest, the creaking of trees, distant animal calls, the occasional rustle of underbrush. But then I noticed something different, heavier, deliberate sounds, like someone walking across the forest floor. The steps were slow, measured, and seemed to circle the cabin. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer or a raccoon or some other wildlife common in the area. But the sounds didn't match any animal I knew. There was a weight to them, a distinct rhythm that suggested something larger. I froze near the window, straining to see anything beyond the circle of flashlight and firelight, but the darkness was thick and unyielding. Hours passed. Every few minutes, the sound would return, close enough that I could hear the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs under heavy feet. I kept the fire going, moving slowly around the cabin, checking the windows, trying to convince myself it was just wildlife. But the sense of being watched was overpowering, pressing against my chest, making each breath feel shallow. At one point, I caught a glimpse of movement just beyond the tree line, a flicker of shadow that vanished the instant I blinked. My hands trembled slightly as I fumbled with the matches to keep the fire alive. I realized I had to secure the cabin. I locked the doors, wedged the furniture against them where possible, and checked the windows. Every creak of the wooden walls, every whistle of wind through the gaps sounded amplified, like it was echoing some presence just beyond. The fire had dwindled to a low glow, and I fed it more wood, listening to the muffled thumps outside. The weight of isolation, the sheer darkness, and the uncertainty of what was out there combined into a tension I could physically feel in my chest. Sleep was impossible. I lay on one of the narrow beds, eyes open, firelight casting weak glows into the room. The noises outside continued sporadically, some near, some far, but always deliberate. I tried to make sense of them, telling myself over and over that there was a reasonable explanation. Hunters, a large animal, someone else renting property nearby. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit the pattern. The sounds moved in a way that suggested observation, circling, testing boundaries. Around midnight, a particularly loud thump against the side of the cabin made me sit up sharply. I could hear scratching along the wooden siding, uneven and persistent. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it would give away my presence if anyone, or anything, was outside. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept to the door. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but shadows and trees. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but curiosity and the need to understand what I was hearing drew me to the edge of the porch. The beam of the flashlight swept over the forest floor and caught nothing. No movement, no figure, only darkness and the occasional shimmer of leaves. The noise stopped. Silence returned, but it was an even heavier silence, the kind that presses down and makes your ears ring. I stayed on the porch for what felt like hours, listening, straining to catch any sound, any hint of movement. Then, slowly, faint crunching returned, further away this time, receding into the blackness. I didn't follow. I didn't want to. The sound diminished gradually until it was gone, leaving only the low whisper of wind in the trees. By dawn, exhaustion overcame the tension. I hadn't slept, but I had survived the night. The forest outside was transformed in the daylight. Trees that had seemed oppressive and menacing now looked normal, even peaceful. Birds called from the canopy, and a thin mist clung to the undergrowth. I stepped outside, surveying the perimeter. The ground was disturbed in several places, trampled leaves and broken branches forming tracks that suggested a large animal, or multiple animals, had circled the cabin overnight. I photographed the marks, careful to document what I could, though I knew no one would fully understand how real the fear had felt. After breakfast, I packed up the cabin, deciding not to linger another night. As I loaded my car, I felt the eyes of the forest on me once more, the trees silent witnesses to the tension of the previous night. Driving back down the dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror at the cabin, receding into the distance, small and solitary. I promised myself I would never return. The experience stayed with me, not like a ghost story or an imagined fear, but as a stark, realistic reminder of how isolation in the wrong place can strip away comfort and leave only raw, primal awareness of what lies in the shadows. I shared my experience with the rental agency, emphasizing the signs of disturbance around the cabin. They acknowledged the report, mentioning occasional sightings of wildlife that could be dangerous and cautioning other renters, though no one ever seemed to confirm exactly what had caused the night's terror. I realized later that the most terrifying part had not been an attack or direct threat, but the uncertainty, the raw vulnerability of being alone in a remote place where the rules of the city didn't apply, where the smallest sound could mean life or death. Months later, I still recall every detail vividly. The smell of damp pine, the creak of the cabin floor, the flicker of shadows in the firelight, the thud and scrape outside in the dark. It left a mark, a lesson in awareness and respect for nature and solitude. I never returned, but the experience taught me to prepare carefully, to trust instincts, and to understand that sometimes the real horror is not monsters or myths. It is the stark reality of isolation, the awareness of how vulnerable a single human can be when surrounded by endless, indifferent wilderness. I had been driving for hours on narrow, twisting roads lined with dense pines and oaks, the kind of roads that made you feel like the world had been cut off from everything else. My goal was a small cabin my uncle had bought years ago, sitting on a remote piece of land in the mountains, far from any town or main highway. The GPS signal had long since vanished, leaving me with only the map my uncle had mailed me and the faint memory of his directions from years before. The last few miles were rough, the road crumbling in places, and littered with rocks and fallen branches. The sun was dipping low, burning orange and gold across the trees, and shadows stretched long and uneven across the path. I had driven carefully, but each bend brought the road closer to disappearing into the forest, until I finally spotted the cabin, its weathered wood blending into the landscape, almost invisible against the surrounding trees. The cabin looked small from the outside, more like a sturdy hunting lodge than a place for living, but it had been built to last. A wide, wraparound porch stretched across the front, with a few rocking chairs that had seen better days and a small stack of firewood leaning against the wall. The windows were dark and reflective, and the chimney, though empty now, hinted at the warmth the place could provide in winter. I parked my car in a clearing just beyond the porch, stepping out to stretch and take in the quiet. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, a smell so strong it almost felt like a physical presence. No sounds of people, vehicles, or even distant wildlife reached me. Only the occasional creak of the trees as a gentle wind passed through. I carried my backpack and a small duffel bag with essentials, enough food and supplies for a few days, and I was hoping to spend the weekend alone, away from work and the city noise. The porch floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, immediately feeling the drop in temperature. The cabin interior smelled faintly of old wood and something else, a mix of mildew and dust that seemed to settle into the corners. The living room was small, with a low ceiling and a single window that let in fading light. There was a fireplace with old ashes and a few logs stacked to the side. I set my bags down and went through the small kitchen, checking the stove and sink, and then made my way to the bedroom. It was modest, a bed, a dresser, and a small desk. I placed my things down, glad to see the blankets were clean, and glanced out the window. The forest was already swallowing the edges of the clearing in darkness, the tall trees casting long shadows that flickered in the wind. By the time I had unpacked, the sun was gone, and the forest outside had turned into a wall of near-complete darkness. I lit a lantern in the living room, its yellow glow painting soft circles across the walls, giving the cabin a quiet, almost comforting warmth. I made a small fire in the fireplace, the crackle of burning logs filling the room and making the shadows dance. The forest outside was silent, but there was a faint sense of movement. It could have been the wind shifting the branches, but I kept catching glimpses of something at the edge of my vision. Trees swaying unnaturally or shadows that didn't align with the wind. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the exhaustion from the drive and the strangeness of being completely alone. I decided to take a short walk around the clearing before it got too dark, flashlight in hand. The beam cut a narrow path through the trees, illuminating roots, fallen branches, and patches of moss. The cabin, once a comforting sight, now felt like a small island in the middle of a sea of trees. I walked slowly, listening. My footsteps sounded unusually loud against the forest floor, but every so often, I thought I heard other sounds, a branch snapping, a rustle that didn't match any wind movement. I stopped, holding my flashlight out in front of me, scanning the darkness. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick, and the trees so tightly packed that my beam barely reached more than 10 feet in front of me. I convinced myself it was just small animals moving through the brush. Deer, maybe a fox. I had read about coyotes being active at night in these mountains, but nothing I heard could be pinpointed. Returning to the cabin, I felt the warmth of the fire and the stability of the four walls around me, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. I prepared a simple dinner, beans and bread, heating them on the stove. The smell was oddly comforting. I ate slowly, listening to the occasional creak and pop of the wooden cabin settling, or maybe just the sound of the trees brushing together outside. Afterward, I sat in one of the rocking chairs by the fireplace, letting the firelight fill the room, and tried to relax, reading a book by the lantern. Outside, the wind had picked up, whispering through the trees, and I kept noticing sounds that seemed to be moving closer. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to check the perimeter again. The moon was bright, but it barely penetrated the forest's thickness. I walked slowly, keeping close to the cabin, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the darkness. I noticed footprints in the soft earth near the edge of the clearing. Human footprints, too large to be mine. My heart rate spiked. They didn't seem fresh, but I couldn't be sure. They came from the edge of the forest and stopped just short of the clearing. I scanned the trees with the flashlight, the beam catching nothing but branches and shadows. Still, the hairs on my neck stood on end. I decided to head back inside, locking the door behind me. Inside, I checked all the windows. Each was latched, the doors secure. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I paced the room, trying to calm down, listening to every creak, every shift of the cabin. The wind had died down, and now the forest was eerily silent. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you notice even the tiniest sound. Then I heard it, a low, deliberate crunch of footsteps just outside the cabin, moving slowly from one side to the other. I froze. The sound wasn't natural, not like a deer or a raccoon. It was careful, deliberate, almost patient. My mind raced. Whoever it was could be just a hiker or hunter. But why hadn't they announced themselves? Why were they lingering in the dark? I grabbed the phone from my pocket, checking for a signal. Nothing. No bars. I tried to remember the directions my uncle had given me for emergencies, but I realized I was alone, completely cut off. I spent the next few hours in the living room, moving from the fireplace to the desk and back, keeping the fire going, listening. The footsteps came and went at irregular intervals, sometimes close, sometimes fading back into the forest. I kept a baseball bat close by and a small knife in my pocket, just in case. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow outside seemed to shift toward the cabin. Every sound felt amplified. The wind occasionally rustled through the trees, but now it seemed like it was carrying the footfalls closer. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, my nerves raw. The first light made the forest look almost peaceful, but I knew it was only an illusion. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. The footprints from last night were gone, but new ones appeared around the edges of the clearing, closer this time, circling the cabin in a wide arc. Whoever had been there had spent the night moving around me unseen. My stomach turned. I quickly gathered my things, deciding to leave immediately. As I drove back down the crumbling road, the forest seemed alive, every branch, every tree, every shadow watching. The sun rose fully, burning through the mist in the valleys, and I finally reached a place where cell service returned. I called my uncle, telling him I wasn't coming back for now. Later, I learned that the area had a few cases of squatters, people who lived off-grid and sometimes moved through the forest at night, avoiding any traceable presence. It explained the footprints, the careful circling of the cabin, and the sense of being watched. No harm had come to me, but the thought of someone moving unseen in the dark, so close, made my skin crawl even weeks later. The cabin was beautiful, isolated, and quiet, but I realized that isolation could hide more than peace. There were shadows in the forest that could wait silently, watching, knowing you were there while you slept, and the memory of that made me wary of going back alone. The experience stayed with me, the way the wind sounded like whispers, and how the trees seemed to lean in, almost eager to conceal something waiting just beyond the edge of light. I eventually returned, this time with friends, and we installed motion sensors and reinforced the doors. The first night with people around was easier, and the feeling of being watched dissipated. I explored the forest during the day, mapping paths, understanding the terrain, and realizing that while it was beautiful and remote, it wasn't empty. Wildlife and humans alike passed through these woods. The key was respect, preparation, and knowing the difference between being alone and being vulnerable. The cabin became a retreat, a place where I could feel safe because I had acknowledged the risks, prepared for them, and had others around when it mattered. It remained my escape from the city, but I never again underestimated how close someone or something could be without your knowing, and how that closeness could make every shadow, every sound, and every night feel far longer than it had any right to. Even now, years later, when I drive past that stretch of road, I remember the quiet darkness, the circling footsteps, and the way the trees seemed to lean closer, as if they were hiding something waiting. It taught me that solitude in the forest isn't always peace. It can be awareness, and awareness is the difference between leaving unharmed and leaving as just another story the forest keeps to itself. I remember the first time I went to that cabin. It was late October, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The forest surrounding it was dense, mostly tall pines mixed with a few scraggly oaks, their leaves long gone, leaving bare, twisting branches. The road that led to the cabin was little more than a dirt track, overgrown in places and slick with fallen leaves and early frost. By the time I arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the shadows between the trees were deep and solid. There was no cell phone signal. There wasn't even a clear view of the sky because the canopy was so thick, and the fading light made the world seem more enclosed, tighter, heavier. The cabin itself was small, made of old logs, the kind that had been cut and stacked decades ago. It looked sturdy but tired, the roof sagging slightly in the middle, shingles missing in patches, and the windows dusty and streaked from years of rain and wind. The porch creaked under my boots, and when I stepped inside, the air was musty and cold, smelling of old wood and damp fabric. I had brought some supplies, enough to stay a couple of nights. A small bag of food, a lantern with extra fuel, blankets, and a few candles. The cabin had a wood stove, which was crucial because the temperature had already dropped close to freezing. I started a fire immediately, the smell of burning pine filling the room and giving me some comfort. I spent the next hour checking the cabin, making sure the windows latched and the doors closed tightly. One of the doors didn't lock properly, but the old bolt on the inside worked, and that would have to do. I unpacked my things, laid the blankets neatly on the bed, and tried to relax, though there was a tension in the air I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear at first. It was just an awareness of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere, far from any help, with only the sounds of the forest outside. Night fell quickly. With no streetlights or passing cars, darkness enveloped the cabin like a thick blanket. The lantern flickered as I read by its light, and every small noise, the wind through the pines, the occasional snapping of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote, felt louder than it should have. Around 11, I went to check the fire. The wind had picked up, rattling the window panes and making the cabin groan in ways it hadn't during the calm afternoon. I stacked a few more logs, trying to ignore the chill creeping through the floorboards. It wasn't long after that when I first noticed it. A sound outside, low and deliberate. At first, I thought it was a branch falling, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But then I realized it wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a crunching pattern like someone, or something, was walking around the cabin, just beyond the line of trees. I froze, listening. My heart was racing, but I kept as still as possible, waiting for the sound to either go away or become identifiable. The noise continued for several minutes, circling the cabin, stopping occasionally, then moving again. I could hear it moving slowly, deliberately, boots crunching on frozen leaves, or claws scratching the ground. I checked the windows. Outside, in the dim light of the moon, all I could see were the dark shapes of trees, shifting slightly in the wind. No shadows moved between them, but I knew something was out there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but the thought of stepping into the forest at night, in freezing conditions, with only a single flashlight, seemed more dangerous. I lit another candle and tried to focus on the fire, telling myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, moving near the cabin. But the sounds didn't match anything I knew. They were too heavy, too deliberate. I sat by the fire for what felt like hours, listening. At some point, the steps stopped. Silence settled over the cabin, heavy and complete. I tried to sleep, but every crack of wood, every rustle of leaves outside, made me jump. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to another sound, this one closer. A tapping, soft at first, like a finger lightly drumming on the wooden walls. Then it became more pronounced, moving across the cabin exterior, pausing at each window, as if someone was testing them. My pulse shot through the roof. I stayed still, thinking, calculating. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were closed. Whoever, or whatever, was out there couldn't get in easily. But the knowledge didn't make me feel safe. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously opened the door, just a crack, to peek outside. The beam swept across the yard. Nothing. Only the forest, quiet and dark, the ground glistening with frost. I stepped outside fully, flashlight in hand, moving slowly around the cabin to see if I could find a trail or any sign of movement. There were footprints in the dirt, large, booted, leading from the tree-line around the side of the cabin and disappearing into the woods behind me. I didn't recognize them. They were human-sized but too heavy, the imprint deep and deliberate. No one should have been here. I went back inside and secured everything again, placing a chair under the doorknob as a precaution. I couldn't sleep, not really. I kept thinking about the footprints and the sound of deliberate movement outside. At some point, as the sky began to lighten, I finally dozed, exhausted and tense. Morning brought no relief. The sun was weak behind thick clouds, barely lighting the clearing around the cabin. I stepped outside and examined the yard. More footprints had appeared overnight, circling the cabin, leaving the snow and frost disturbed. I realized then that I hadn't heard footsteps leaving. Whoever had been there had stayed close, watching, waiting. Panic began to settle over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed a plan. I packed my things, deciding to leave immediately, but as I loaded the last of my gear into the car, I noticed something else. The firewood pile, which I had neatly stacked the day before, was disturbed. Logs were scattered, some broken, arranged in a way that suggested someone had leaned against them, or worse. The sense of being watched returned, sharp and insistent. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine, listening. There was no one there. Nothing but the wind and the distant groan of the trees. I drove slowly back down the dirt road, eyes darting to the tree line, scanning for movement. Every shadow seemed like it might hold something, every bend in the road a potential hiding place. When I finally reached the main highway, relief washed over me. I stopped at the first gas station I saw, shaking, and called a friend, telling them where I had been. I didn't stay long. Weeks later, I learned that a group of hikers had been camping nearby the same week I was there. One of them had reported hearing heavy footsteps around their tents at night and waking to find items moved or missing. Rangers investigated, but found nothing conclusive. I don't know who, or what, was in those woods that night. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin. The forest itself, with its dark, enclosed paths and the way it swallowed sound, felt alive in a way I couldn't describe. I could still see the footprints in the frost, the broken logs, and hear the echo of heavy steps circling, always circling. Since then, I avoid isolated cabins in dense woods, especially in late autumn and winter when the cold and darkness make the world seem smaller and stranger. I stick to populated trails, cabins near towns, anywhere I can be seen or helped quickly. The memory of that night still comes back in dreams sometimes, and when it does, I feel that same icy weight in my chest, the sense of being watched, the echo of footsteps that don't belong to anyone I've ever met. I learned that some places are just too lonely, too quiet, and too easy for danger to hide in plain sight, waiting patient until it knows you're alone. I remember the first time I stayed in that cabin. It was deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town, and I had convinced myself that isolation would be peaceful, maybe even freeing. The drive up the winding dirt road was long and exhausting, with trees pressing in on both sides, their branches scratching against the car windows like fingernails. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had begun to sink behind the mountains, casting long, dark shadows across the uneven ground. The cabin itself was old, made of rough-hewn logs darkened by years of weather, with a tin roof that had rusted in patches and a small porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The air smelled of pine, wet earth, and something faintly metallic, though I didn't think much of it at the time. The first thing I did was unpack the car, moving slowly because I could feel the cold creeping into my fingers, even in the late summer. I stacked firewood by the porch, careful to keep it dry, and lit a small lantern inside the cabin. The interior was dim and smelled of dust and wood smoke, a faint, lingering odor of mold in one corner where the roof had leaked in a previous storm. The floors were uneven, with boards that creaked sharply under every step. I set my bag down by a small table and tried to ignore the way the walls seemed to lean in slightly, as if the cabin itself were watching me. I told myself it was silly, just the imagination. As night fell, the sounds outside became more pronounced. The wind moved through the trees, making a low, moaning sound, and every so often, a branch would snap under its own weight or from some unseen animal. I could hear the distant howl of a coyote, then the rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I tried to focus on small tasks, checking the fireplace, stacking more wood, making sure the lantern had oil. But the noises didn't stop. They grew more varied, closer, and harder to place. Something scuttled near the cabin, a fast, deliberate movement that I couldn't see through the darkened windows. My stomach twisted, but I kept telling myself it was just a raccoon or a deer. I slept fitfully that first night, waking every hour to a new sound. The floorboards groaned beneath me, the wind tapped at the windows, and once, I could have sworn I heard something scratching at the door. Morning brought a false sense of relief. Sunlight poured into the cabin, and the forest looked peaceful in the early light. Birds were chirping, a small stream babbled in the distance, and I felt foolish for being so jumpy. I spent the day exploring the area, walking the perimeter of the clearing, noticing signs of animals, claw marks on tree trunks, flattened grass where deer had bedded down, and tracks that led nowhere I could follow. It was the second night when everything started to feel wrong. I had been reading by the fire, the lantern flickering, when I heard a sound outside, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the gravel and dead leaves. I froze, straining to listen. They stopped near the porch, then moved around the side of the cabin. I didn't make a sound, didn't even breathe, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a branch falling. But the sounds didn't leave. They circled the cabin slowly, methodically, always stopping where I couldn't see. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to leave, but the nearest town was miles away, and the dirt road had washed out a bit from recent rains. My car was parked in the clearing, but to reach it, I would have had to walk through the dark woods. I sat still for hours, listening to the footsteps that seemed to echo in my mind more than the clearing. Every now and then, I heard a faint rustle, a soft scraping, like something brushing against the cabin's walls. The fire had burned low, and the shadows danced across the room, making the corners seem darker than they were. I tried to stay rational, telling myself that maybe some deer or a large raccoon had found its way close to the cabin, but deep down, I knew the rhythm of the movements didn't match any animal I'd ever heard. Sleep came eventually, but it was shallow. I dreamed of being outside, moving through the forest, always feeling eyes on me, always hearing that slow, deliberate step following just behind. When I woke, the lantern had gone out. My fire had died. The morning light didn't help as much as I hoped. I felt exhausted and hollow, like a part of me had been left in the night. I decided to stay inside, checking the cabin from the windows, scanning the tree line for any movement. By midday, I began to gather wood again, but every trip outside made my skin crawl. Branches snapped underfoot, shadows shifted unnaturally, and I was sure I saw shapes moving between the trees. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was tired, hungry, and constantly on edge, my nerves raw from hours of listening and watching. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the cabin seemed to shrink around me. I couldn't tell if the sounds were outside or inside, and every little noise made me jump. Then I heard it, a sharp, distinct tap at the window, like a knuckle knocking. My heart stopped. I stayed as still as possible, my eyes fixed on the spot. After a long moment, it came again, then again, slow, deliberate, a rhythm meant to be noticed. I realized with a sickening certainty that someone, or something, was out there, watching, waiting. I gathered the courage to look outside, but the forest was thick, dark, and silent. No figure, no movement, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I checked the perimeter, walking cautiously, my bare feet crunching on the gravel. There was nothing, only the marks of animals, but the feeling of being watched remained. I realized I had been right all along. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't animals. Someone had been circling the cabin, hiding, waiting for me to leave or fall asleep. The next day I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, keeping my movements quiet, and loaded the car. I waited until the sun was high, then left the cabin without looking back. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every shadow along the road seemed like someone standing there, waiting to stop me. I arrived at the nearest gas station with my hands shaking and my heart pounding, trying to tell myself it was over. Weeks later, I returned with the police. They searched the cabin, the surrounding woods, and the road leading up to it. There were no signs of anyone having stayed there recently. No tracks, no evidence, just the marks of wildlife and the uneven earth around the cabin. It made me question what had happened, if maybe it had been my imagination running wild from isolation and fatigue. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt, the deliberate steps, the taps on the window, the circling in the dark. I would never stay in that cabin again, and I would never forget the feeling of being watched when there was supposedly no one there. Even now, I can remember the smell of the damp earth, the cold bite of the wind through the broken windows, the way the shadows clung to the walls inside, and the sound of those steps moving around the cabin as if it had a mind of its own. That cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by something just as unsettling. The certainty that someone else had been there, hidden in the dark, waiting. And I'll never go back to see if they still are. I remember driving up the winding dirt road, the tires crunching over loose stones and patches of dried leaves, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. The forest on either side was dense and dark, the tall pines and oaks leaning over the road like silent sentinels. I had found the cabin online, listed as remote and quiet, and the pictures had made it seem cozy, tucked into a small clearing far from the nearest town. The reality was even more isolated. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was just a low orange smear behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. The cabin itself was made of weathered logs, the kind that had seen decades of rain and wind. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch creaked underfoot as I stepped onto it. The windows were clouded with dust, and the front door, though solid, looked like it had been left to the elements for years. I unlocked it and pushed it open, the hinges groaning loudly, echoing into the empty interior. Inside, the air was heavy and cold, carrying the smell of damp wood and something faintly sour, like old mold. Dust motes floated in the last rays of sunlight that managed to sneak through the dirty windows. I dropped my bags on the floor and started inspecting the cabin. The living area had a stone fireplace, blackened from years of use, and a wooden table with chairs that wobbled when I touched them. The kitchen was small, with a rusted sink and counters covered in dust and stains. There was a bedroom off to one side, a single bed with a thin mattress, and a bathroom with a cracked mirror, and a sink that leaked slightly when I turned the tap. Everything felt untouched for a long time, like someone had walked away and never come back. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but tried to brush it off. I had stayed in remote cabins before. The isolation was part of the appeal. I spent the next hour getting the fireplace going. The wood stacked outside was damp in places, and it took several attempts to get a decent fire going. By the time the flames caught, the cabin glowed faintly with a warm orange light. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I could hear branches snapping under their own weight, but inside, I felt a small sense of comfort. I unpacked some food, boiled water for coffee, and settled in with a blanket on the creaky couch. Night came quickly. The sky outside darkened to a deep blue, and the forest became almost impenetrable in the shadows. I had brought a lantern and some flashlights, but I kept the fire going as my main source of light. Everything outside the cabin seemed alive in a way I wasn't used to. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, sounded amplified in the quiet. I told myself it was just deer or small animals moving through the forest, but the feeling of being watched was difficult to shake. I checked the locks on the door and windows, making sure everything was secure, even though logically, I knew the nearest neighbor was miles away, and any person would have to drive an hour just to get here. As the night deepened, the noises in the forest grew. A distant howl echoed between the trees, low and mournful, and my stomach tightened. I had heard wolves in these woods before, but the sound was closer than I had anticipated. I tried to focus on the fire, keeping it alive, feeding small logs one at a time. The crackle and pop of the flames became almost hypnotic, but then I heard it, a distinct thump against the outside wall of the cabin. My heart stopped. I froze, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like someone stepping cautiously across the deck. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers trembling, and shone it toward the window. Nothing. Only shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I reminded myself that it could be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the wood. But then I heard another sound from the other side of the cabin, a dragging noise, faint but definite. My pulse raced, and I moved toward the door, flashlight in hand. Every step creaked, announcing my movement to whatever might be outside. I reached the porch, shining the beam over the clearing. There was nothing, just the black silhouettes of trees and the ground littered with leaves. I scanned the forest, my breath catching in my throat every time a branch snapped nearby. Nothing moved, but the sense of being observed didn't fade. I tried to laugh quietly, telling myself I was letting my imagination run wild. I went back inside, bolting the door and pulling a chair against it for extra security. I sat back down, the firelight flickering across the walls, but sleep didn't come. Every noise outside, the wind shifting, the branches rubbing together, even the faint crunch of snow or leaves underfoot, felt magnified. I started checking the cabin again, going through each window and door, making sure everything was locked. The flashlight's beam danced across the room, catching every shadow, and I realized that the darkness outside made the cabin feel smaller, almost suffocating. Hours passed slowly. The fire burned low, and the wind picked up, rattling the cabin and making the walls groan. I could hear something moving near the back of the cabin again. This time, it was deliberate, slow, and cautious, almost like someone was circling. My stomach twisted, and I debated leaving, but the forest around the cabin was impenetrable in the dark. My only option was to stay put and hope that whoever, or whatever, was outside would leave. I kept the lantern close, the weak light casting shadows that danced across the walls. The sounds continued sporadically, never constant, always just enough to keep me tense. Eventually, I decided to try to sleep. I moved the chair back, closed the bedroom door, and lay down under the thin blanket. The noises outside didn't stop, but they became a background rhythm. I told myself I would leave first thing in the morning, after daylight returned. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the occasional noise that made me sit up and listen. Morning arrived slowly, the first light of dawn creeping through the dirty windows. I opened the door cautiously, the cold air hitting my face. The forest was still, eerily quiet. I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The ground was covered with scattered leaves, but no footprints. No signs of anyone having been near the cabin, except for the tracks of deer and small animals. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the unease lingered. My body was tense, adrenaline still high from the night's events. I decided not to waste time. I packed quickly, leaving behind nothing that might weigh me down, and locked the cabin securely. As I drove away, the winding road stretching before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me all night. The thought was unsettling, but there was nothing I could do about it. The cabin faded into the trees behind me, looking just as empty and uninhabited as when I had arrived, and yet I knew I wouldn't be returning. The experience left a mark, a constant awareness of how vulnerable isolation can make you feel. The forest was beautiful, serene even, but it was alive in ways that I hadn't fully appreciated before. I had faced the night alone, and though I made it out unharmed, the tension and fear had been real, palpable, and unforgettable. Even now, thinking back, I remember the smell of the damp wood, the cold that seemed to seep through the floorboards, and the sounds that made me jump at every turn. It taught me a lesson about being truly alone in the wilderness, and about the small but important things, like a locked door, a fire, and a flashlight, that can mean the difference between feeling safe and feeling hunted. The cabin stood silently in the forest, waiting for the next visitor, and I knew it would take someone else's courage or recklessness to experience the same fear that I had. I left with a mix of relief and lingering dread, grateful for daylight, for the safety of a road, and for the ability to drive away from a place that had made me feel truly exposed, aware of every sound, every shadow, and every inch of the wild around me. I remember the first time I went out to that cabin. It was late summer, the kind of summer that hangs in the air like a thick blanket, making the evenings warm but the mornings sharp and cold. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a dense forest, a small clearing surrounding it just wide enough for a car to squeeze in and for some grass to grow. The structure was old, probably built decades ago, with logs darkened by age and weather, and a roof that had clearly survived more storms than I cared to imagine. From the outside, it looked cozy, almost inviting, but there was a stillness to it that didn't sit right. Standing there on the porch, I could feel the silence pressing in from the woods, a quiet that felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. The path leading up to the cabin was narrow and overgrown, more of a track than a road. Driving up, I had to swerve around fallen branches and large stones that dotted the path. Each bump in the car made my stomach tighten, the sound echoing in the quiet like a warning. When I finally pulled into the clearing, I stepped out and noticed how the forest seemed closer than it should have been, the trees towering over the cabin like silent sentinels. There was no wind, not even the faintest rustle of leaves, and the air felt heavy, humid but still. I shook it off and carried my bag inside. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood, old blankets, and a faint dampness that suggested it hadn't been aired out in a while. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the furniture was sparse. A table, a few chairs, and a couple of rickety beds pushed against opposite walls. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a stack of firewood beside it, and a lantern hanging on a hook near the door. I set down my bag and began inspecting the place, opening the windows to let in some air and checking the locks. Everything seemed intact, but the quiet felt denser inside, as if the walls themselves were listening. That evening, I decided to make a fire. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was turning into a black mass, the edges blurred in shadow. I stacked some logs in the stove and struck a match. The flame caught, flickering and casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I sat back in a chair and watched the fire, the warmth comforting but the silence pressing. Outside, I could hear nothing. Not a bird, not the wind, not even the scuttling of small animals. The quiet was so complete it was almost loud. I tried to read, but every time I turned a page, the creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, and I imagined something moving just outside the window watching. Around midnight, I went to bed. The mattress was thin and hard, the blankets rough against my skin. I kept the lantern lit, more for comfort than anything else, and lay listening. At first, there was nothing. The silence remained, absolute and complete. But then I thought I heard it, a subtle sound, like something brushing against the cabin from the outside. I froze, straining my ears, and the sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, and after a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been the wind, a branch against the roof. I tried to sleep, but every small noise, the crack of the firewood, the distant rustle of leaves, made me startle awake. Hours passed like that. I would drift into half-sleep only to be jerked awake by noises I couldn't place. A soft scrape on the porch, the brush of something moving outside, the occasional thump that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Each time I convinced myself it was nothing, but each time the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I got up and checked the windows. All were closed, the locks secure, and yet the sensation of someone, or something, lurking beyond the walls refused to fade. By dawn, I was exhausted but restless. I left the cabin and walked the perimeter, looking for any sign of animals or intruders. There were tracks in the dirt outside, but they were strange, inconsistent. Too big for a deer, too small for a bear, the impressions oddly spaced. I traced them through the clearing and toward the edge of the forest, where they disappeared into the shadows. I tried to shake the unease, telling myself the tracks belonged to some wild animal passing through, but there was a pattern to them that made my stomach tighten, as if whatever had made them had been circling the cabin watching. That day passed in a haze of anxiety and vigilance. I kept checking the locks, inspecting the windows, and sitting near the door with a heavy stick in my hand. Every sound outside made my pulse spike, the distant caw of a bird, the flutter of leaves, the snapping of a twig. By evening, I was too wound up to eat or relax. I built another fire, keeping the lantern nearby, and sat in a chair facing the door, eyes constantly scanning the shadows beyond the clearing. Darkness fell quickly in that forest, the trees swallowing the edges of the clearing, and with it, the cabin seemed to shrink, confined within the weight of the shadows pressing from all sides. Around midnight, I heard it again, louder this time. A distinct, deliberate scraping at the porch, followed by the sound of wood shifting, like someone leaning against the wall. I froze, every muscle tense. The lantern flickered, casting long, uncertain shadows that made the corners of the cabin seem to writhe. I gripped the stick, my knuckles white, and held my breath. The sound continued intermittently, scraping, shifting, moving around the cabin. Then silence again. I waited, straining to hear anything, the minutes stretching unbearably. When nothing came, I dared to peek out the window. The clearing was empty, but I could see movement at the edge of the forest, shadows slipping between the trees like liquid. I knew I couldn't stay inside, trapped by fear. At first light, I packed everything quickly. My hands shook as I threw blankets, clothes, and the few supplies into my bag. I took one last look around the cabin, the walls and floorboards suddenly hostile and unfamiliar, and stepped outside. The air was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth inside. I moved quickly down the path, keeping my eyes on the edge of the forest. Every rustle, every whisper of movement made me tense, but I kept walking, stepping over the branches and rocks, moving faster than I ever had in that stretch of clearing. By the time I reached my car, the sun was rising, spilling pale light across the path and the tops of the trees. The forest seemed less menacing in the daylight, but the memory of the night lingered, a tight knot in my chest. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove off the narrow track, glancing in the rearview mirror. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, swallowed up by shadows that the morning couldn't fully chase away. I didn't look back after that, focusing only on the road ahead. When I finally got back to a place with other people, the sense of isolation faded, but the fear remained as a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. The cabin itself had been untouched, structurally sound and unremarkable, but the experience stayed with me. I realized that what had terrified me wasn't anything supernatural, wasn't a ghost or a creature from a story. It was the silence, the isolation, the knowledge that something unseen could be just beyond the walls, watching, moving, and waiting. I never went back, and I don't think I ever will. That cabin, the forest around it, and the oppressive quiet had carved themselves into my memory. A reminder that some places are dangerous simply because the unknown is enough to keep you awake, tense, and unsettled, even when nothing directly harms you. I remember driving down the winding dirt road toward the cabin, the sun just starting to dip behind the dense forest. The gravel crunched under the tires, and every time I hit a small rock, it jolted through the floor of the old car. I had been excited about the trip for weeks, seeking some quiet away from the city, away from the constant hum of lights, cars, and people. The cabin was in a remote area, far enough from any real town that the GPS signal faded completely once I hit the last turn off the main road. That thought both thrilled me and unnerved me a little. It was exactly what I wanted, solitude. But as the shadows stretched and the trees thickened, I began to notice just how dense and unbroken the forest really was. There were no other houses, no signs of life, just the dark green mass of pines and oaks pressing in on both sides of the narrow road. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the last traces of sunlight were gone, leaving a soft gray twilight. The cabin itself looked older than I expected. Its wood siding was dark and weathered, the kind of wood that had soaked up decades of sun, rain, and snow. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney, meaning someone had been here recently, though no one was around now. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the front steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the lock to turn after several tries. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and something faintly metallic, probably from rusted tools stored in a corner. I dropped my bags and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The first flames seemed to flicker unevenly, struggling to catch, but after a few minutes, they grew strong and steady. The warmth felt good against the sudden drop in temperature outside, and the light made the room feel a little less empty, a little less like I was the only person alive in the middle of a vast forest. I had expected isolation, but the silence here was deeper than I anticipated. It was the kind of silence that made every creak and snap of wood or shifting of the fire feel amplified. After setting up the fire, I wandered around the cabin, taking note of every detail. The furniture was sparse: a wooden table with 4 chairs, a couple of cabinets with basic dishes, a small bed pushed into the corner, and a loft that could be accessed by a narrow ladder. The windows were thick with grime and dust, making it hard to see the forest outside clearly, though I could just make out the silhouettes of the trees swaying gently in the wind. Everything looked untouched for months, maybe even years. There was a sense of abandonment here, even if it had been maintained enough to still be livable. Night fell fully, and I ate a simple dinner I had brought along. The sounds outside the cabin had grown sharper. The wind rustled through the branches, and somewhere, a bird or small animal let out a sudden cry. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the natural life of the forest, but the darkness pressed against the windows in a way that felt oppressive. It was more than just visual darkness. It felt like the trees themselves were leaning in, watching. After dinner, I decided to explore the area immediately surrounding the cabin. I walked down the small path behind it, trying to stay close to the clearing where I could see the moonlight reflecting off patches of snow that hadn't yet melted. The forest floor was uneven, littered with fallen branches and thick patches of dead leaves. Each step felt deliberate, cautious. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me tense. I noticed animal tracks, deer mostly, but also smaller ones that I couldn't immediately identify. The forest was alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, and it was then that I realized how easy it would be to lose the path and be swallowed by the trees. I turned back before venturing too far. Back in the cabin, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The sense of isolation was both thrilling and unnerving. I tried to focus on reading a book by the fire, but every time I looked up, I felt the weight of the darkness pressing against the walls. At some point, I noticed a faint sound from outside, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed too deliberate to be random. My heart jumped, and I strained to listen. The sound would stop, then start again a few seconds later. It wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. I couldn't see anything outside, just the black silhouettes of trees. I considered that it might be some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe a falling branch or an animal dragging something. But the pattern was too consistent, too purposeful. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, shining the beam into the forest. The light cut a narrow path through the trees, illuminating nothing but leaves and trunks. The sound stopped as soon as I was outside. I scanned the clearing and the shadows beyond, and after a few tense minutes, I decided to head back inside. As the night grew colder, the noises became more frequent. Thumps, scratches, something moving just beyond the reach of my firelight. I stayed in the cabin, huddled near the fireplace, flashlight at the ready. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how exposed I really was. The cabin was just a thin layer of wood and nails between me and whatever was out there. The thought was both terrifying and oddly fascinating. Around midnight, I was awakened by a loud crash from the back of the cabin, near the small storage shed I hadn't explored yet. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight and carefully approached the door. The shed door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. I shone the light inside, but it was empty. The crash had apparently come from the interior walls, as though something had struck them from the inside. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps the wind had blown a branch into the wall, or maybe a raccoon or deer had gotten inside. I decided to stay up the rest of the night, unable to sleep with that sound echoing in my mind. Hours passed slowly. Every rustle, every snap made me jump. I kept checking the windows, listening intently. The forest felt alive, almost aware of my presence. The moon moved across the sky, casting eerie shadows through the dirty glass. Morning finally came, pale light seeping into the cabin. I stepped outside, cautious but determined to check the surroundings in daylight. The forest looked entirely different in the morning sun, less threatening, more natural, but still imposing. I inspected the shed and found signs of animals. Squirrels or raccoons had clearly been inside, leaving bits of food and droppings. The thumping, the crashes, it seemed plausible now that they had caused at least some of the night's disturbances. I decided to make the day productive, exploring the paths leading out of the clearing. I found a small creek not far from the cabin and a few clusters of wild berries. The forest was beautiful, but I remained aware of how easily one could get lost. I marked trees along the way to ensure I could find my path back. The daylight made the forest navigable, but I knew the shadows would return, and with them, the same uneasy tension from the night before. That evening, I prepared another fire and settled in with a sense of accomplishment. I had survived the first night, explored the area, and realized the disturbances weren't supernatural, just animals and natural occurrences amplified by fear and darkness. Still, I remained cautious. I kept a log of every noise, every movement outside. The cabin, though old and weathered, felt increasingly like a fortress the more I understood it. On the third night, I was better prepared. I reinforced the shed door with some old planks I found, cleared some brush around the cabin to improve visibility, and made a small pile of stones in case I needed to create noise to scare animals off. The forest still pressed in, still loomed, but I had a plan. Every sound, every movement was noted and rationalized. The fear was still there, but it had shifted from paralyzing terror to cautious respect. By the fourth day, I had developed a rhythm. Mornings were for exploration, afternoons for maintenance and preparation, evenings for fire and observation. The nights were still tense, but I had learned to manage my fear, to stay alert without panicking. I realized that the cabin, the forest, and the solitude were teaching me more than I had expected. The sense of danger was real, but it was manageable, tangible, and understandable. On the final night, I sat by the fire reflecting on the experience. The forest was alive, yes, but it was a natural life, not something malevolent. The crashes, the thumps, the sounds that had terrified me were all explainable. I had learned to observe, to anticipate, to prepare. The cabin was old and creaky, but it was solid. I could survive here. I had survived here. Morning arrived, clear and bright. I packed my belongings carefully, made one last sweep of the cabin, and locked the doors behind me. Walking back to the car, I felt a strange sense of calm and accomplishment. The forest had tested me, but it had also shown me resilience, patience, and awareness. The sun rose higher, and I drove away, the gravel crunching under the tires now sounding less ominous and more like a familiar rhythm. The forest receded in my rearview mirror, vast and endless, but no longer threatening. I had faced the isolation, the darkness, the unknown, and emerged with a clear understanding and a sense of mastery. The cabin, the forest, the long nights, they were behind me, but the lessons I had learned would stay with me forever. The drive back to civilization was quiet, but I didn't mind. I had the memory of the forest, the cold nights, the fire, the thumps in the dark, all recorded vividly in my mind. I felt stronger, more alert, and more aware of the world around me. The cabin had been scary, but it had also been a place of growth. By the time I reached the first signs of the city, the streetlights, the hum of traffic, the distant sirens, I realized I wasn't just leaving the forest behind. I was bringing I remember the drive up to the cabin vividly. The road was nothing more than a rough dirt path, winding through thick forest on either side. The sun was low in the sky, filtering through the dense pine trees in long, slanting beams that painted the dust in the air gold. Every so often, a gust of wind would shake the treetops, sending a cascade of needles down like rain. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, a chance to get away from the city and the noise, to be completely alone in the woods. What I didn't anticipate was how alone it would feel once the sun dipped completely below the horizon. The cabin itself appeared out of the trees suddenly, small and made entirely of dark, weathered logs. Smoke from the chimney rose lazily into the evening air, a faint promise of warmth inside. The front porch sagged slightly, and the boards creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and pine resin. The door was old, with a rusted iron handle, and when I turned it, it groaned in protest. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a thick layer of ash already visible in its hearth. The furniture was sparse, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed in the corner with a thin mattress. The floor was made of worn planks that creaked with every step. I set down my bag and unpacked a few essentials. The cabin was quiet in a way that felt unnatural at first. There was no hum of electricity, no distant road noise, no chirping of crickets yet. Just the faint whisper of the wind outside and the occasional snap of a branch. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace to keep warm and to illuminate the cabin. Matches struck with difficulty in the damp air, but eventually the kindling caught. The flames licked upward, casting long, moving shadows across the walls. The glow was comforting, but it also made the darkness beyond the windows seem deeper. Night fell quickly. The forest outside seemed to close in around the cabin, swallowing the last traces of twilight. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, but mostly it was silence. I ate a simple meal from the cooler I had brought, trying to ignore the growing feeling of being watched. It wasn't that I actually saw anything, but the awareness of the dark, empty forest pressed in on me. After dinner, I decided to explore the property. The cabin sat on a small clearing, perhaps 50 yards across, before the trees began again. I walked to the edge of the clearing, my flashlight cutting through the blackness. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place, yet every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, small animals moving in the underbrush, nothing more. But there was a rhythm to some of the sounds, a pause, and then another step that didn't feel natural. Returning to the cabin, I double-checked the locks and windows. The door rattled slightly in the wind, but otherwise seemed secure. I sat in a chair by the fire, trying to calm my nerves, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of the forest. After a while, I convinced myself I was imagining things. It had to be the isolation playing tricks on me. I told myself I would go to sleep, wake up early, enjoy a quiet morning, and all of this would just be part of the experience. I didn't sleep well. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. Branches snapping, the wind rattling the roof, distant calls of animals I couldn't identify. Around midnight, I heard something different. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, outside the cabin. At first, I froze, straining to hear. The steps moved around the perimeter, pausing occasionally. The sound of crunching leaves and twigs was unmistakable. Whoever, or whatever, was outside knew I was in there. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. I thought maybe it was a deer, but the rhythm of the steps, the weight behind them, didn't match any animal I knew. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window. The beam swept over the trees and the clearing, but nothing moved. No shadows, no figure, nothing. Yet the sound continued, circling the cabin. My rational mind screamed that it was probably an animal, maybe a bear, maybe someone hiking in the area. But the area was remote, miles from the nearest trail. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. The footsteps stopped. For several long minutes, there was nothing. Then a knock on the door, faint but deliberate. I froze, unsure what to do. The door was locked, but that didn't ease my fear. I moved to another window to look out, scanning the darkness, shining the flashlight in every direction. Still nothing. I considered calling for help, but cell service was weak at best, unreliable at worst. My rational mind kept trying to argue that the woods could play tricks, shadows could bend and stretch, noises could echo strangely. But the knock had been real, tangible, and it had come from outside. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, sitting close to the fire with the flashlight across my lap, listening. Every time the wind shifted, I imagined footsteps. The fire died down, leaving the room darker than before. I refilled it with logs, trying to maintain a circle of light and warmth. The forest outside was alive with noises now, far more intense than before, and every time a branch cracked, I jumped. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts, interrupted by the slightest sound. Morning finally arrived with a dull, gray light. I opened the door cautiously, peering out. The clearing was empty. No footprints in the soft dirt, no disturbance in the underbrush. Nothing. My unease eased slightly, but I remained cautious. I decided to explore further during daylight, hoping to make sense of the previous night. I walked through the forest, flashlight in hand, inspecting the perimeter, trying to find tracks or signs of an intruder. I saw some animal tracks, deer, probably raccoon, but nothing human. The forest seemed normal, peaceful, though every few minutes, I would hear a noise behind me, a snap of a branch, rustle of leaves, making me spin around. By midday, I had convinced myself that the night had been an exaggeration, that isolation had amplified every minor sound. I returned to the cabin, feeling some relief as the sun climbed higher. I spent the afternoon chopping firewood, checking the cabin for weaknesses, reinforcing windows and doors where I could. Every so often, I would hear a distant sound, a rustle, a snap, or a low groan of the trees, but the sun made the forest less intimidating. Evening came again, bringing shadows and lengthening shapes. I lit the fire early, prepared to stay vigilant. The wind picked up, rattling the roof and shaking the trees, sending long shadows across the cabin walls. Around 8 o'clock, I heard it again, footsteps in the clearing, slow and deliberate. My pulse quickened. I stayed by the window, watching, flashlight in hand. The steps moved along the edge of the clearing, close to the tree-line. No figure was visible, yet the sound of weight, of someone moving, was unmistakable. I decided to wait it out. I kept the fire high, maintained the circle of light, and sat silently listening. The steps circled the cabin, coming closer, then receding, like a predator testing its prey. Then, after what felt like an eternity, silence fell again. Hours passed. The fire burned low. My eyes grew heavy. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slept fitfully in the chair, still alert enough to wake at the slightest noise. At dawn, I woke to silence and the gray light of morning. I carefully stepped outside, scanning the clearing and the surrounding forest. Nothing moved. The dirt was undisturbed. No footprints of any kind. I realized the person, or animal, had left sometime during the night. Relief washed over me. I spent the morning packing some things, deciding not to risk another night. I took a long walk down the dirt path, making sure the cabin was secure, then left, glancing back only once. The cabin stood there, silent and empty, with smoke still curling lazily from the chimney, a small, harmless structure in a vast forest. Driving back down the rough road, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. Nothing tangible had happened in the end, nothing confirmed, yet I would never forget that feeling of being watched, the slow, deliberate footsteps around the cabin, the knock on the door that came from nowhere. It was a reminder that isolation magnifies fear, that the mind fills in the blanks with what it expects or fears the most. But I left knowing I was safe, knowing the forest, while intimidating, had no supernatural force. It was just the raw, unsettling presence of the wilderness, patient and silent, indifferent to anyone who passed through it. The fear stayed with me, but it was a fear rooted in reality, and somehow that made it manageable, and even afterward, it felt like an experience I could carry with me without breaking me. The cabin itself remained a distant shape in my memory, its dark logs and creaking floors, the heavy silence, the small circle of firelight. I never saw or heard anything again like that, yet the sense of awareness, the instinct to notice every detail, stayed with me long after I left the forest behind. It became a story I told myself over and over, a reminder of how the world can feel larger and stranger when you are alone, and how even the simplest place, a small cabin in the woods, can hold a tension that tests every nerve. I never returned to that cabin, and I don't think I will. But I remember every detail, every sound, every shadow, and every heartbeat of that long, uneasy night. The memory is sharp, real, and completely human. It doesn't need anything supernatural to terrify. It is fear itself, distilled into one long night, in one small cabin in the middle of nowhere. The forest remains the same as ever, indifferent, quiet in the daylight, alive at I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the line of tall pines, casting long, dark shadows over the narrow dirt road that led to it. The place was isolated deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization. Even though I had been here before during the day, the approaching darkness made it feel like a different world entirely. The air had a sharp bite to it, and the smell of damp earth and pine needles was thick and heavy. I parked the car on the small gravel patch near the cabin and stepped out, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing down on me. There were no sounds of traffic, no voices, only the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. The woods seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting to see what I would do next. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. Its wood was aged and weathered, grayish-brown with the sun having bleached it over years of exposure. A thin layer of moss clung to the north side, and the roof sagged slightly, though not dangerously. The windows were dark, reflecting the last streaks of sunlight like black mirrors. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell of old wood and faintly of mildew hit me immediately. It wasn't unpleasant, just raw and untouched. The cabin had a single room that combined a small kitchen and a living space, and a narrow stairwell led up to a loft where the sleeping area was. I dropped my bag near the door and ran my hands over the counter, feeling the grooves and roughness of the wood. Everything was still, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. I set about lighting a small fire in the stone fireplace, careful to arrange the kindling just right. Sparks leapt from the logs as the flames caught, and the cabin slowly filled with a warm, flickering light. The sound of crackling would seem unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent cabin. I watched the shadows dance across the walls, long and jerky, stretching the corners of the room. Once the fire was stable, I went outside to gather some more wood. The forest around me was thick, and as I stepped onto the soft bed of pine needles, the ground felt uneven beneath my feet. Every step made a faint crunch, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. The light from the fire behind me cut through the dark like a thin line, and the trees seemed to press in closer, their branches swaying even though the air was still. I collected a small pile of logs and stacked them near the cabin door, trying to convince myself that I was only being cautious. But there was something in the silence that felt alive, like the forest was watching, waiting. I went back inside, shutting the door and pulling the bolt across. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in with the night. I sat by the fire, absently poking at it with a stick, when I heard it, the first sound that didn't belong to me or the fire. It was a soft, deliberate scraping, like something heavy moving across wood. I froze, listening. It came again, slower this time, as if whatever it was testing the structure of the cabin. My heartbeat quickened. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a deer brushing against the outside wall. But the sound didn't stop. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the window, shining it across the dark forest. The beam sliced through the black, revealing the trunks of trees and the underbrush, but nothing more. I circled the cabin slowly, trying to see if anything had left marks or tracks, but the ground was soft from earlier rains, leaving the forest floor looking like one uniform carpet of needles and mud. I kept walking around the cabin, shining the light into the dark, my hands trembling slightly. That's when I noticed the prints. They weren't small like a raccoon's, and they didn't match any deer tracks I had ever seen. They were human-sized, deep impressions in the soft earth, starting at the edge of the woods and leading straight toward the cabin, stopping abruptly at the porch. A cold sweat ran down my back. I backed away, my mind racing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old print from hikers or hunters, but the soil had been wet all morning. No one had been here until I arrived. The prints were fresh. I went inside quickly, locking both doors, and sat back down by the fire. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had imagined the sound of scraping, that the prints had to be old. But the firelight, dancing over the walls, cast shadows that seemed too deliberate, almost like they were moving on their own. My ears strained for any sound. Then I heard it again, footsteps slow, deliberate, approaching the cabin. My stomach dropped. The steps paused at the edge of the porch, just outside the door. The wood groaned faintly under the weight. My hand hovered over the fireplace poker, and I gripped it tightly. The footsteps moved slowly along the perimeter of the cabin, circling from one side to the other. The scrape I had heard before returned, closer this time, like something scraping against the side of the building. I tried to think clearly. The cabin had no other exits besides the door I had entered through, the loft window, and a small basement hatch beneath the floorboards, which was heavy and locked with an old padlock. I grabbed my keys and flashlight, weighing my options. Running through the woods seemed impossible. It was dark, I didn't know the terrain, and whatever was outside could be anywhere. I stayed put, moving quietly, trying to listen. The fire flickered, and I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window, a shadow moving along the far wall of the cabin. It was too fast, too precise, like whoever or whatever it was knew exactly where I was. I backed away, keeping low, and tried to slow my breathing. The shadow paused, and the night went silent again. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. Eventually, I realized that whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. The footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. I stayed by the fire until the flames burned low, listening for any hint of movement outside. When I finally stepped outside again, the forest was quiet. The prints, however, had not disappeared. They led into the woods, disappearing among the trees. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was just breaking through the canopy, casting golden streaks across the forest floor. The air was fresh, and the smell of wet earth was strong. I examined the area around the cabin more thoroughly. There were no footprints beyond those I had seen the night before, no signs of broken branches or anything else suggesting recent passage. It was as if whoever had been there had vanished completely. I searched the trees for anything unusual, but there was nothing. I stayed inside the cabin for most of the day, keeping the doors locked and the fire going. I explored the small loft, the corners of the room, even the attic space above the ceiling beams, trying to make sense of what had happened. Everything was exactly as it had always been, old wood, familiar cracks, no sign of intrusion. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. By the second day, I began to notice small details I had missed the first time. The subtle scuff marks near the porch, tiny scratches on the siding that looked fresh, a displaced rock by the edge of the cabin. Each one confirmed the events of the night before. Whoever had come to the cabin had been cautious, deliberate, and remarkably silent. I decided to stay until evening, thinking that leaving too soon might be dangerous. I kept the fire burning high and stocked it with extra wood. As night fell, I watched the shadows of the trees stretch long across the clearing. The wind whispered through the branches, creating faint sounds of movement, but nothing approached the cabin. I realized I had survived the first night. The fear was still there, low and persistent, but manageable. I started planning my departure in the morning. When dawn finally came, I packed my things, making sure to lock the cabin behind me. I followed the narrow dirt road back to the main highway, constantly scanning the woods. I didn't see any sign of the previous night's visitor, and I didn't hear a single noise that made my stomach twist with fear. By the time I reached the paved road and the first glimpse of a passing car, relief washed over me. I never saw the footprints or the shadowed figure again, and I never returned to that cabin alone. But the memory of that night, the sense of isolation, and the knowledge that someone had been there, observing me, stayed with me for a long time. It was a reminder of how vulnerable you are when you are alone in the wild, how quickly quiet can turn into fear, and how careful you must be, even in places that seem safe. The cabin was still standing when I drove past months later, empty and silent, the same old wooden structure, but I never stepped foot inside again. The experience had left its mark, a lesson carved into my memory as sharply as the footprints in the soft forest floor outside the cabin. The woods can be beautiful, they can be peaceful, but they can also be patient, and they can hold secrets that no fire or flashlight can chase away. And sometimes the fear isn't about what is there. It's about what could be, waiting quietly, just beyond the edge of sight. I learned that night that safety is fragile, that silence can be as loud as a scream, and that some places, no matter how familiar, carry the weight of uncertainty that never fully lifts. I still think about the cabin, sometimes, when I'm driving past a stretch of forest, or when the wind rattles the trees outside my window. The memory doesn't haunt me with images of a face or a shadow. It haunts me with the knowledge that someone had been there, and I had no way to know why. It left me cautious, hyper-aware, but also strangely respectful of the isolation, of the wild, and of the fact that some experiences in life are unforgettable because of how real and unexplainable they are. Even now, years later, I can feel the weight of that night pressing down when I close my eyes. The dark, the silence, the careful, calculated steps on the porch. The fire I built still flickers in my mind, casting long, uncertain shadows across walls that were supposed to be safe. And though I have moved on, I know that cabin in the woods will always be a part of me, a reminder that fear is often not born of ghosts or monsters, but of